On October 5th, 2020, a 23-year-old girl named Marisela was spending time at one of the nightclubs in Dallas. Unfortunately, the night didn't end for her quite as she had planned. Her new acquaintance, an aspiring rapper named Chuck, turned out to be not as cool of a guy as he presented himself. This story has plenty of oddities: disappearances, an international hunt, a possible love triangle, witchcraft, and a whole lot of deception. On October 5th, 2020, Marisela Botello-Valadez booked a flight from Dallas, Texas, back to her hometown of Seattle, Washington. The 23-year-old had flown in for a few days to visit an old friend and ex-boyfriend, Raul Ortiz. But when boarding for her plane was announced that day, Marisela was not among the passengers. Her name was called out several times over the airport's loudspeaker, requesting her to proceed to the terminal. However, Marisela never showed up. As the plane finally took off, the seat assigned to Marisela remained empty. In Washington, her parents and younger brother were waiting, and the family was extremely worried. Marisela was a caring and loving older sister, a cheerful, sweet, and hardworking daughter. Her father and mother were proud of her, and when she missed her flight, they were gripped by worry that instantly escalated into grave concerns. Something terrible had happened. Skipping her flight was out of character for Marisela. There had to be compelling reasons for this to occur. The parents immediately started calling their daughter but received no response. They then tracked down the number of the friend she was visiting, but he also couldn't provide any concrete information. The family deemed it necessary to contact the police right away. The girl's friend, Raul, woke up at his home in Dallas and discovered that Marisela had not returned to his apartment the previous evening. He had no idea where she could be. Earlier, the guy had partied hard and drank too much, even losing his house keys. While waiting for his roommates to return and let him inside, Raul simply passed out on the doorstep of his apartment. Marisela didn't want to spend her last night in Dallas sitting in the entryway. She hailed a taxi around midnight and headed back to the city alone. The driver dropped her off near a nightclub where drunken dancing and people partying hard were still going on. She paid the cab driver and continued to enjoy herself. Afterward, surveillance cameras at one of the establishments captured Marisela walking through the parking lot accompanied by a man. The stranger's face couldn't be discerned, but the girl was recognized by the purple dress she was wearing that night. Footage from another camera further away again showed the two walking towards a vehicle, later identified as a black 2014 Audi. Marisela got into the car with the unknown man. The cameras lacked audio recording, so at that point, it was unclear whether she had chosen to get into the car voluntarily or if she had been coerced. No one saw her again. Friends, over 90% of viewers watch videos without subscribing to the channel. Check if you're subscribed. If not, please be so kind as to subscribe to the channel to support me. Several days passed after the girl's disappearance. There were no charges on her debit or credit cards. Marisela didn't appear on social media. Her mobile phone was also unreachable. Calls and messages from worried family members and friends remained unanswered. The family informed the Dallas County Police that Marisela would never get into a car with a stranger near a nightclub. So initially, detectives considered the possibility that they were dealing with an abduction. This was the case until they managed to track the black Audi on parking lot cameras at a store at 1:28 a.m. The car's driver and Marisela Botello-Valadez entered the supermarket together. The footage showed her smiling as she approached the refrigerators and selected a drink to purchase. Based on the store's video recordings, the young woman was not actually being held by force or led anywhere against her will. License plate readers installed throughout the city revealed that the Audi was registered to a 31-year-old Mesquite resident of Dallas County named Charles Chuck Beltran. A comparison of the car owner's driver's license photo with the man in the supermarket video footage confirmed that they were the same person. Charles, or Chuck Beltran, worked as a security guard at a club near where he met Marisela. Chuck had a criminal record. He had spent 2.5 years behind bars for aggravated robbery. He was convicted after beating a man with an unloaded gun and taking his wallet. When investigators checked the geolocation data from Marisela's mobile phone, They discovered that her last known location matched a home address in Mesquite, Dallas County, where the owner of the black Audi was registered. This was the house where Chuck Beltran lived. It turned out that the girl had voluntarily gone to his home, and no one had seen or heard from her since. On the afternoon of October 14th, 10 days after the disappearance of 23-year-old Marisela Botello-Valadez, Dallas County police officers, led by an FBI special agent assigned to assist them in the investigation, knocked on the door of the house where the girl was last seen alive. The house was located about a 20-minute drive from the nightclub, where Marisela had been partying on the night of October 4th. Receiving no response, the police called the landlady, a woman named Lisa Dykes. The owner explained to the law enforcement officers that she hadn't seen Chuck for several weeks. When asked about her relationship with the young tenant, she refused to answer. Lisa simply stated that she had no way to contact Chuck and had no idea where he might be. In fact, Chuck Beltran was not currently a suspect. The police merely wanted to ask him a few questions to obtain information regarding Marisela, since he was essentially the last person to see her alive. Meanwhile, Marisela's family was beside themselves with worry. There had been no news from the girl for about 2 weeks. They were afraid to admit even to themselves that something terrible had happened to her. Every day, they prayed to God that the girl would be found alive and unharmed. Words cannot express the pain and despair experienced by people who have lost loved ones. The complete uncertainty, the faint hope for a favorable outcome, and at the same time, the expectation of the worst possible conclusion. Unable to locate Chuck Beltran, law enforcement obtained a warrant to search the house where he lived. It was Marisela's last known location, and the search had to start there. The dwelling was a sorry sight. It seemed as if the occupants had taken necessary items and moved out in a hurry. Everything left in the house was scattered about. Cabinet doors were left open. Piles of trash littered the floors and countertops. A mattress leaned against the wall in the hallway. In the kitchen, dirty dishes with unfinished pizza mixed with cleaning supplies were left in the sink and on the table. It was unclear how long ago the residents had left the house, but during that time, the ceiling above the main bedroom had collapsed, leaving a heap of insulation right on top of the dresser. The house was in chaos, as if the occupants had simply abandoned everything and left, intending never to return. The police also noticed a curious miniature statue set up as a sort of shrine in one of the rooms. Although it was not given any significance at the time, the figurine was later identified as Santa Muerte, a kind of female Grim Reaper with a scythe. She is the personification of death and is worshipped in Mexican Catholicism, as well as in new forms of paganism. Santa Muerte is considered an unbiased figure who accepts people as they are, regardless of their religious views or status. Something had clearly happened in the house, and to find out what, specialists sprayed a liquid chemical mixture throughout the house, which is used to detect bloodstains. In the guest bathroom, a small area along the doorway and the bathtub itself glowed blue, indicating a positive reaction to the presence of blood. The guest bedroom, where it was later discovered that Chuck Beltran had been staying, attracted the most interest. In this room, a section of the carpet under the window had been noticeably cleaned. Despite obvious attempts to hide the stains, red and brown streaks still showed through under the opening. When the reagent was applied to this area, the result was positive. Analysis of the carpet sample confirmed what the investigative team suspected. It was the blood of Marisela Botello-Valadez. 2 more blood samples were also found on the carpet, 1 male and 1 female. They were presumed to belong to one of the residents. The police spoke with the neighbors and learned a lot of interesting things about what had been going on in that house. 3 people lived there: 31-year-old Chuck Beltran, 56-year-old Lisa Dykes, and a 48-year-old woman named Nina Moranova. Lisa Dykes, the homeowner and landlady, had worked as a legal assistant in litigation for over 30 years. During that time, she had been married 3 times and raised 3 children. According to neighbors, she had unceremoniously kicked out her youngest 20-year-old daughter, Chelsea, allegedly to move Chuck Beltran in. According to Lisa's colleague at the law firm, Lisa stated that her children were old enough to live separately and that she wanted to live in her own home the way she wanted. Apparently, this life included an intimate relationship with the young security guard and aspiring rapper, Chuck. He had his own bedroom, as well as a studio room with soundproofed walls. In reality, the musician's workspace was a closet covered in acoustic foam. That's where he recorded his songs. Lisa bought Chuck a car, the black Audi, registered a small business for him, and financed his music videos. One such video was recorded right on the driveway of the house in Mesquite. Lisa's legal colleague, as well as her hairdresser and longtime friend, told investigators that the nature of Lisa's relationship with Chuck was evident. She financially supported her young lover and made no secret of it. This relationship between them persisted even after Lisa Dykes married her best friend in 2019, the recently widowed 48-year-old Staten Island lawyer Nina Moran. It was a same-sex marriage. According to the same sources, Lisa's married life was also a kind of financial arrangement. Nina Moran had inherited a substantial estate from her late husband. She had also had a successful legal career in New York and earned a good income. After the wedding, Nina retained part of her work and home in Pennsylvania. Most likely, this woman was involved in Lisa and Chuck's arrangement. After moving into the Dykes' house, when it came time for the spouses to choose a common surname, they both rejected their own and instead took Chuck's surname, officially becoming Lisa and Nina Beltran. Cell phone data showed that all three residents were in the house with Marisela on October 5, 2020, the day of her disappearance. Therefore, arrest warrants were issued for all three, Chuck Beltran, Lisa Dykes, and Nina Moran, on suspicion of committing a serious crime. None of them had appeared at home, they were not answering their phones or calls, and the whereabouts of all three remained unknown. Records of Lisa and Nina's phone movements showed that on the night of October 5th, both devices moved from the house in Mesquite to an area south of Dallas and Wilmer. The vicinity where Dykes and Moran were located, according to cell phone tower data, was heavily forested and close to several bodies of water. Dozens of officers from various law enforcement agencies began organized searches for possible remains of Marisela in this area. Throughout November 2020, rescue teams combed the area defined by the cell tower data but found nothing. It was only 5 months later, in March 2021, that a hunter tracking wildcats stumbled upon what appeared to be a human skull in a wooded area. This was near where law enforcement had searched several months earlier. Dental records confirmed that the remains belonged to Marisela. Due to natural decomposition and the impact of wild animals on the bones, the medical examiner was unable to determine the exact cause of the girl's death. 2 days later, law enforcement in Miami, Florida, tracked down Nina Moran and made an arrest. She and her wife Lisa had been renting a house in the area. Although after Nina was detained, Lisa managed to disappear again. At this point in the investigation, there was no indication that Chuck was anywhere nearby. The women maintained contact with him via text messages while they continued to hide from the police, and the content of these messages spoke for itself. Lisa wrote to Chuck that it seemed the girl had been found, and now warrants were out for all three of them. At the same time, she tried to find a lawyer for Nina, who was being held in a Florida county jail. A few days after Nina's arrest in Miami, 57-year-old Lisa was found near Orlando. Before ending up in Florida, the women had crossed the Mexican border several times in vehicles registered in their names, traveled through a couple of states, and were ready to settle in Miami. After the first call from FBI agents about their relationship with Chuck, the spouses became anxious and took several steps to avoid arrest. They contacted a neighbor, who was also a realtor in Pennsylvania, and put Nina's house up for sale. The proceeds were supposed to help them finance their attempts to evade justice. They then arranged for Chuck's black Audi to be delivered to Pennsylvania, knowing that the car would be sought in connection with Marisela's disappearance. However, all of this did not help them hide in a way that they could not be found. Lisa Dykes was arrested while talking on the phone with her lawyer. The police managed to have her extradited back to Texas. By May 2021, Lisa and Nina were brought back to Dallas. Each posted a $500,000 bail and was released with GPS ankle monitors under house arrest. In addition to tampering with evidence, they were charged with the murder of Marisela Botello-Valadez. Chuck Beltran was also detained. Law enforcement found him in Utah, where he was living with the family of his ex-girlfriend, who was also the mother of one of his children. Lisa Dykes and Nina Moran complied with the terms of their release for several months, from May 2021 to December of the same year. During this time, they planned their escape. On Christmas morning at 7:30 a.m., both GPS ankle monitors were disconnected within about 4 minutes of each other. Taking advantage of the holiday bustle and shortage of resources in the Dallas Pretrial Services Department, the women were able to disappear and remain unnoticed for a full 2 days. It was only on December 27th that pretrial services learned that the monitors had been disconnected. Police sent the fugitives emails and text messages, but received no response. By that time, Lisa and Nina had traveled about 14,000 kilometers and boarded a plane. First, they booked tickets in their own names to Seoul, South Korea, and then on to Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia. Cambodian immigration officials confirmed that the couple had entered the country and had not left its borders. Once again, the FBI was brought in on the investigation. Coordinating their actions with Cambodian authorities, as well as with the country's largest bank, agents were able to identify cash withdrawals made by Lisa and Nina. Security camera footage from one of the ATMs where the accomplices withdrew cash captured the license plate of the car that had delivered the women to their destination. Cambodian police tracked down the taxi and interrogated the driver. The man directed them to an address where 2 foreign women were staying in a house in the coastal town of Sihanoukville. Lisa and Nina Beltran were detained once again. In February 2022, they were extradited back to Texas, but this time they were held in custody without bail. The trial dates for both women were set for 2023. Both refused to plead guilty to the murder of 23-year-old Marisela. At this point, it was becoming clear that these 2 ladies had played a certain role in the crime, but their motive had not been revealed. It also remained a mystery what had actually happened in Chuck Beltran's bedroom that night. By the time the first of the scheduled trials in Lisa Dykes' case began, Chuck Beltran had decided to cooperate with the district attorney's office. He offered to testify and tell the jury what he claimed had happened to Marisela. That night, Chuck returned home not alone, but accompanied by a girl. They had a few drinks and, intoxicated by alcohol and passion, tumbled into bed. When Lisa, in a fit of jealousy, burst into his bedroom at night and found an attractive young girl sleeping on Chuck's shoulder, she grabbed a knife and took her rival's life. Chuck woke up at the moment when Lisa was straddling Marisela and stabbing her. Nina Moran entered the room after the attack had occurred. Realizing that his new acquaintance was no longer alive, Chuck ran out of the house, leaving his 2 girlfriends in the blood-soaked room with Marisela, whom he had brought home just a few hours earlier. Afterward, the body of the young, cheerful girl who had come to Dallas for the weekend was found on a country road south of the city. Lisa Dykes' defense team insisted that she had no motive to take Marisela's life because she hadn't even seen her. According to them, Lisa was not a jealous mommy who flew into a rage when Chuck brought home a new girlfriend. There was supposedly no romantic relationship between Lisa and Chuck, and the woman was already used to new girls appearing in his bed from time to time. Chuck Beltran called himself Chuck the Magnificent, or Chuck 50-50. This meant that he was 50% amazing and 50% crazy. Lisa couldn't care less about the women who appeared in their home. She saw the young man as a talented, aspiring rapper, so she invested money in his development, assuming that sooner or later her investments would pay off. And all these convoluted talks about a love triangle were nothing more than rumors. To make sense of the strange relationships in the house of Chuck, Lisa, and Nina, the court called Katie Dalen as a witness who had long worked as Lisa Dykes' hairdresser. The woman who looked after the youthful lady's hair said that one day she came to her salon very upset, and the reason was that the day before she had come home from work and caught her wife, Nina Moran, in bed with Chuck. Lisa was so enraged that she directly stated that she wanted to grab a knife and destroy them both. But then, after talking to Nina, she cooled down a bit. From the witness's testimony, it was possible to establish a motive: Lisa's incredible obsession with Chuck Beltran. The woman did not want to share him with anyone, not even with Nina, whom she herself had brought into the house. Kathy said that after meeting Chuck at the bar managed by Lisa's son, Lisa decided to radically change her appearance. She started getting tattoos, getting short haircuts, and dyeing her hair in bright shades. Around the same time, the woman lost almost 27 kilograms, had a lower facelift and hip surgery. It was believed that all these changes were made to please Chuck and attract his attention. In a strange and unexpected way, Kathy the hairdresser demonstrated another extreme aspect of Lisa Dykes' personality. Once, while visiting her client's house, she noticed a large statue of the Grim Reaper. The owner, noticing Kathy's interest, joked that she was practicing witchcraft. The next witness was a friend from Pennsylvania, realtor Jamie Scarpa. She described the panic and urgency with which Nina Moran and Lisa wanted to sell the house. Both women were passing through Pennsylvania. They specifically came to prepare the house for sale and sign some documents. When realtor Jamie Scarpa, who had been a guest at Nina's house many times, entered the house, she was struck by the outward changes in the rooms. Usually her house was bright, with the windows always open. Now all the windows and doors were covered with black sheets. The house was pitch dark. In the hallway closet stood a huge life-size statue of the Angel of Death, and in front of it lay a mat, the kind people usually pray on. After selling the house, concerned buyers found another figurine of the Grim Reaper in a smaller size, left by the previous residents on a small side table in the bedroom among candles and glasses for alcohol. The new owners speculated that the house was a place of worship for Santa Muerte. The key prosecution witness was Chuck Beltran. The man offered several versions of his story to law enforcement before settling on one of them. At first, he said that Marisela got into his car but got out before reaching the house. Then he told the police that the girl went with him, but left the house safe and sound. In the next version, Lisa Dykes took Marisela's life, after which Nina entered the room and participated in the attack. The final version he told the jury was that the murder was committed solely by Lisa Dykes. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like this video. It's really important. The man woke up to Marisela's screams and saw Lisa straddling her with a knife in her hand. He tried to push the woman off, but ended up knocking both of them off the bed. On the floor, the rivals still didn't let go of each other, and Chuck tried to pull Lisa away by force. When he managed to do so, the girl just lay motionless on the floor. Lisa started yelling that she had forbidden Chuck to bring other women into her house, and now he should also take his things and go to hell. The guy, realizing that a crime had just occurred in his room, suggested calling 911, but Lisa pointed him to the door. Chuck cowardly decided that since Lisa had staged the bloody massacre herself, she should deal with it herself. He got dressed, grabbed his things, and left his patron's house. Chuck was well aware that he was the last person to see Marisela alive, and that all suspicions would fall on him first, so he felt it necessary to hide far away. Cell phone location data fully corroborated Chuck's testimony regarding his movements. He left Lisa's house and went to his ex-girlfriend's apartment. Early the next morning, his car had an oil change, which was also documented. Chuck didn't approach Lisa's house until she called him herself and told him he could return. Entering his bedroom a few days later, the man noticed that the room had been thoroughly cleaned. The women told him they had taken care of everything. When the police, led by an FBI agent, raided the house 10 days after the crime, Nina and Lisa were terrified. They hastily packed their things and went on the run. Chuck followed them, as he didn't think anyone would believe in his innocence. He knew that both of his roommates were lawyers who were acquainted with various attorneys, and he, having a prior criminal record, was the most suitable candidate for the role of the perpetrator. In essence, Chuck Beltran's entire story was aimed at blaming someone else for the crime. The deal with the police implied that all charges against him would be dropped if he testified against Lisa Dykes and told the whole truth about that horrific night. Another interesting point was that 3 different blood samples were found at the crime scene. The first DNA profile matched Marisela Botello-Valadez, and it was assumed that the other 2 profiles belonged to one of the house's residents. But this turned out not to be the case. Whether this blood belonged to those sacrificed to Santa Muerte or someone just accidentally cut themselves remained unknown. Lisa Dykes testified in her own defense at the trial. She told the jury that Chuck Beltran was a violent man and she was afraid of him. This man allegedly had absolutely no control over his aggression. Lisa insisted, despite the sworn testimony of numerous witnesses, that there had never been a romantic relationship between them. For her, Chuck had always remained only an object of business interests, which had now backfired on her. She called him a wolf in sheep's clothing, implying that Chuck could mislead even the jury with his innocent appearance. Lisa also denied worshiping Santa Muerte or participating in witchcraft rituals. She stated that the altar found in the house belonged to Chuck, and the life-size statue in Nina Moran's house in Pennsylvania was just a Halloween decoration and nothing more. In her testimony, Lisa explained that on the weekend when Marisela disappeared, she was still recovering from a failed hip surgery that caused her unbearable pain. At that time, she allegedly could barely walk and drive. She compared this surgery to giving birth, only physically it was twice as painful. However, on October 3rd, 2 days before the crime, Lisa managed to make a 4-hour trip to Arkansas to watch Chuck's performance at a club. Lisa paid for the show, financed the trip, and accommodations in several hotel rooms for Chuck Beltran and his friends. When the group returned to Texas after the performance, the rapper decided to celebrate with his friends at the club instead of staying with Lisa. That evening, he met Marisela Botello-Valadez and brought her home. Nina and Lisa were asleep in their room. Lisa assured the jury that she had never seen or met the deceased girl, but all her words turned out to be lies. She explained her trip with Nina on the night of October 5th to the southeast of Dallas in Wilmer, where Marisela's remains were ultimately found, as a visit to some warehouses where documents were stored, but there was no confirmation of this. But something else was clear. You are unlikely to list a person in your phone contacts as a lover if you had a strictly business relationship, and Lisa swore that there was no other relationship between them. At the same time, as soon as this woman met Chuck, a man half her age, she changed herself almost beyond recognition, just to meet his demands. However, Chuck most likely only needed money from Lisa. He was not attracted to a woman old enough to be his mother. Unfortunately, an innocent girl who carelessly went to visit a man she barely knew had to pay for everything. The jury returned with their verdict in almost record time, spending only an hour and a half on deliberation. They unanimously found the defendant, Lisa Jo Dykes, guilty of the murder of 23-year-old Marisela Botello-Valadez and tampering with evidence for attempting to hide the dead girl's body in the woods. Marisela's younger brother also testified at the trial, telling the jury about his cheerful, responsive, and kind sister, whom he misses every day. He mentioned that Marisela had indeed made the wrong decision when she got into the car with Charles Beltran on the night of her death. But did she deserve to lose her life for it? Lisa Dykes was sentenced to life in prison. Nina Moran and Chuck Beltran pleaded guilty to tampering with evidence. The charges of taking the girl's life brought against both of them were dropped. Why does God allow people to commit crimes? Why doesn't He punish the perpetrators and protect the innocent victims? Today's story will demonstrate a striking example of divine intervention in the life of an ordinary person, or perhaps it's merely a fortunate coincidence. Late in the evening, on November 15th, 1884, a 20-year-old man named John Henry George Lee was assisting his sister Elizabeth in clearing the table in the dining room of an English manor where they both worked. John was the butler, and his sister Elizabeth was the cook. The manor itself was called Glen, and it was located in a beautiful spot on the seacoast in the village of Babbacombe, England. Many years ago, Glen had been much more magnificent. At one point, even the King and Queen of England had come to stay there, but quite recently, the estate and the family who owned it had fallen on hard times. The adult children had moved away, and the head of the household had passed away suddenly. Only the elderly lady of the house remained at the manor. The staff had been reduced to a small team consisting of just the butler John, the cook, his sister Elizabeth, and 2 elderly maids. This meant that virtually all the physical labor fell on the shoulders of John, the only man in the house. That evening they had cleaned up after a dinner party at Glen, to which the lady of the house had invited very important lawyers and politicians. Now, late at night, John was lugging a huge pile of heavy china from the dining room to the kitchen. At the same time, he was trying to talk to his sister, who was also engaged in washing dishes. But the young woman stubbornly pretended not to hear him and simply did not react at all. While John was carrying dozens of plates at a time, Elizabeth was taking and carrying only a few pieces. This irritated the man. Not only was his sister not helping, but she was also ignoring him. This continued until the woman herself approached him. Elizabeth apologized and blamed it on feeling unwell. John noticed his sister instinctively placing her hands on her stomach and realized that she was pregnant. Just a minute ago, John had been about to get angry at her behavior, but now he understood why she had been acting that way. It should be understood that the woman had not told her brother or anyone else in the house about her condition for a reason. The fact was that the owners of Glen were very religious people and held traditional beliefs. Pregnancy out of wedlock was a sin. Elizabeth was not married at the time. In England, it was considered abnormal to have children out of wedlock. It was an absolute taboo. Despite all the woman's efforts to conceal the pregnancy, John and the 2 other elderly maids very quickly realized what was happening, because every morning they heard Elizabeth retching due to morning sickness. They tried to support her in every way, but the woman categorically refused to acknowledge the fact of her pregnancy. Remembering this, John sent his sister to rest, reassuring her that he could handle the dishes on his own. He didn't even know who the father of the future child was, since Elizabeth refused to talk to anyone about it. But neither he nor the 2 other maids wanted the lady of the house to find out about her condition and fire the girl. Friends, over 90% of viewers watch videos without subscribing to the channel. Check if you're subscribed. If not, please be so kind as to subscribe to the channel to support me. By 11 p.m., John had almost finished all his chores and was exhausted. He was about to go to bed when one of the elderly maids entered the kitchen and informed him that it was time for the nightly prayer. The butler put aside the silverware he was polishing without hesitation and followed the maid to the living room, where the owner of Glen was already waiting for them in her nightgown. The mistress, a 68-year-old lady named Emma Keyse, enjoyed conducting nightly prayers with her staff. She felt that in this way she was taking care of the servants and the salvation of their souls. In fact, John was not a very religious man, but to please Emma, he agreed to perform these nightly prayers. The reason for such an arrangement was that the mistress had essentially saved him several times. John had started working for Emma 6 years ago when he was only 14. He was a difficult teenager, a rude troublemaker, but for some reason, the woman had a soft spot for him. John Henry George Lee, the son of a small farmer, was born in 1864 in Abbots Kerswell, a small village in southern England, and getting to Glen was a kind of achievement for him. When John confessed to his mistress that he dreamed of traveling the world, Emma helped him enlist in the British Royal Navy, and for 2 years the young man served in the military and was indeed able to see the world. He dreamed of staying in the service for as long as possible, but one day he caught a very bad cold and fell ill with pneumonia. The illness negatively affected John's health. He was deemed unfit to continue military service and was forced to leave the army prematurely. Upon returning home due to his health condition, John had no idea what to do next. He had planned to stay in the Navy much longer and was now completely at a loss. Due to the weakness that remained after the pneumonia, he could not engage in heavy physical labor in the village and became a burden to his parents. Fortunately, it was at this moment that Emma Keyse intervened. She gave the young man a glowing recommendation, and one of her wealthy friends agreed to hire John Lee as a domestic servant. The young man was immensely happy that he had some purpose in life again, but his happiness was short-lived. Out of stupidity, he made a mistake. He stole an expensive plate from his master. John had not yet figured out what he was going to do with the stolen treasure when the owner of the estate noticed the loss. And he didn't just scold the young man and make him return the item, but involved the police. Ultimately, John Lee ended up in jail for theft, was held behind bars for 6 months, and when he was released, he was sure that now no one would hire him with such a reputation. And again, for the third time, Emma intervened in the young man's fate. This woman believed that people should be forgiven and given a chance to redeem themselves. Otherwise, once a person had stumbled, they could go down the wrong path. The woman, who had recently lost her husband, understood that now positive recommendations would not save John, so she offered him to return to Glen and work for her. She was just in need of a butler at the time. John could not believe it. He knew he did not deserve a second chance, especially from Emma, whom he had let down so badly by stealing an expensive item in her friend's house. From the bottom of his heart, thanking his savior, he swore that he would do everything in his power to make sure she did not regret her decision. And so far, everything had been just that. John tried his best to please Emma, and if these nightly prayers with the servants were so important to her, then it was not at all difficult for him to pretend that they brought him joy as well. So that evening, John entered the dining room as usual, sat down next to his mistress, and prepared to perform the daily ritual. After Elizabeth and the 2 other elderly maids had taken their places at the table, everyone joined hands and bowed their heads, and Emma began to recite the prayer. As soon as the event was over, the maids went to the kitchen to prepare a cup of hot cocoa for their mistress. The woman usually went to bed very, very late, when all the other inhabitants of the manor were already asleep. Before going to bed, Emma loved to drink hot cocoa, sitting by the burning fireplace, and read or write letters. She enjoyed being alone with herself. The maids left, and John also wished his mistress good night and walked to the pantry next to the kitchen, which also served as his bedroom. Having made his bed, the young man crawled under the covers and immediately fell asleep, as the fatigue accumulated during the day took its toll. Around 3:30 in the morning, John was awakened by someone's screams. Rubbing his eyes and yawning, he ran out of the pantry and saw that the entire kitchen was filled with smoke. Through the smoke screen, he could make out his sister Elizabeth and one of the maids. They were screaming, calling for his help. It was necessary to urgently evacuate everyone from the premises and at the same time somehow try to extinguish the fire. John instantly rushed upstairs to his mistress's room. He felt that Emma might have encountered problems and wanted to save her. Running up the stairs to the 2nd floor, he ran into the second maid, who looked completely crazy. The woman, sincerely worried, informed the butler that she had just been in the mistress's bedroom and could not find her there. Emma's bed was completely engulfed in flames, so the maid could not see whether the bed was empty or whether the owner of the estate was lying there. Realizing the full horror of the situation, the servants in full force rushed for buckets. Having filled them with water, they rushed to the mistress's bedroom to try to extinguish the fire that was rapidly spreading in Emma's chambers. But by the time they got upstairs, the flames had already spread further and were blocking the entrance to the bedroom like a wall. So there was no way to pass through it, and their small buckets of water were of no help. As much as the servants wanted to save their mistress, they had no choice. Unfortunately, they could do nothing against the raging flames. They had to leave her to perish in the fire. Having made the difficult decision, the 4 of them turned around and ran downstairs so as not to be burned alive. Running past the dining room on the 1st floor, the maid and the butler saw Emma lying on the floor. The servants, without even approaching closely, immediately realized from her mutilated body that the mistress was dead, and it was not the fire that was to blame. The terrible wounds on Emma's head indicated that she had clearly been hacked to death. Her neck was cut so deeply that it seemed as if someone had tried to rip her head off. John Lee, Elizabeth, and the 2 maids just stood there in shock, staring at Emma, not even knowing what to do. Then one of the maids, apparently realizing that a crime had been committed, screamed with all her might and rushed outside. The other inhabitants of the house followed her. Several neighbors, local fishermen, and Coast Guard personnel were able to jointly extinguish the fire at Glen. But it was not just a fire. It was a clear attempt to conceal a brutal murder. When the police arrived at the scene, suspicion immediately fell on John. This story took place long before data obtained from forensic laboratories began to be used in investigations. At that time, due to the lack of concrete evidence, law enforcement officers drew conclusions based on their own reasoning, intuition, inner feelings, and assumptions. The detectives quickly determined that whoever had taken Emma Keyse's life and inflicted those terrible wounds on her must have possessed considerable physical strength. Since John Lee was the only man in the house that night and, accordingly, the strongest, compared to the other female residents of the estate, he must have been the perpetrator. Moreover, a small fresh cut was found on his hand. The police also found bloody footprints under the debris of the burned furniture, indicating that Emma had been attacked not in the living room, but in the corridor near the stairs, which was not far from the pantry where John slept. And a bloody axe and knife were found practically right outside the pantry door. In addition to all this, the investigators established that the fire had been set deliberately. The arsonist had doused the entire house with flammable oil, which was stored in the pantry where John Lee slept. Considering all the evidence found, the butler was arrested on the same day that the fire occurred at Glen Manor and when the mistress of the house, Emma Keyse, died. Moreover, he already had a criminal record for theft, so, in the opinion of the police, everything pointed to him. The next day, while John Lee was in a prison cell, a warden suddenly appeared at the door and informed him that a lawyer had come to see him. John was confused because he had no means to afford a lawyer and had no idea where one could have come from. Despite the prisoner's bewilderment, the guard opened the cell door and ordered John to proceed to the interrogation room. There, John was met by a well-dressed, respectable man who was sitting at a table and leafing through some papers. The butler was not actually personally acquainted with this man, but he had heard about him and had repeatedly seen him at Glen Manor as a guest. It was just unclear why he had suddenly decided to defend a simple lackey who had nothing to pay him for his efforts. This man's name was Reginald Templar, and he was a very successful lawyer who was highly respected in the area. He also turned out to be one of Emma's closest friends. Why Reginald Templar, a friend of the deceased woman, was going to defend the lackey who was accused of murdering her remained a mystery, both to John and to the prison staff. It simply made no sense. Eventually, Reginald gestured for his client to sit in the chair and asked him to recount everything he remembered about the evening before the tragedy unfolded. Reginald expressed his confidence that the butler had nothing to do with the death of his benefactress. This gave John hope, and feeling some relief, he began to talk about the events of that terrible day. During the conversation, Reginald took notes, clarified some things, and right there began to create the basis for John Lee's defense. Finding himself back in his cell, the butler felt an incredible surge of energy. With Reginald's help, he really had a chance to be saved from the baseless accusation. However, John's relief was short-lived. The first court appearance went great. Reginald appeared in his fashionable suit, confident in himself, and tore the prosecution's case to shreds. Reginald pointed out to the prosecutor that all the evidence was circumstantial and literally far-fetched. John didn't understand much of what his lawyer was saying. All these legal precedents that the lawyer was discussing were far from the things John was used to, but he could see that the judge was impressed. Reginald said that the police had done a terrible job of investigating the crime, making overly hasty conclusions. The prosecutor looked very nervous at that moment, and John was already genuinely feeling confident about his imminent release. Further court proceedings were postponed. If it had continued in the same rhythm as the first one, it is possible that John would have been released right in the courtroom. But on the second day, Reginald simply did not appear in court without any explanation and did not attempt to contact anyone. John Lee, not understanding what had happened, just sat and waited. He didn't know what the judge did in such cases, and the judge, as best he could, postponed the start of the session, then threw up his hands, looked at John, and said that he was very sorry, but now the defendant would have to defend himself on his own. The clerk announced the start of the trial. Of course, John Lee was not ready for such a turn of events. Not only had he never studied law, he hadn't even gone to school. Therefore, from the second day of the trial, things only got worse for the butler, because Reginald continued to miss sessions without any explanation. And if he did appear in court, he would start unnecessary debates with the prosecutor and the judge over issues completely unrelated to the case, which only increased suspicion against John Lee. He was no longer the astute lawyer, but behaved like some kind of maniac. For example, reprimanding the judge about his hairstyle, but not wanting to discuss the real case at all. During the testimony of witnesses, Reginald also behaved strangely. Instead of asking questions on the merits, Reginald was interested in what they had for breakfast or what their favorite color was. The line of questioning made absolutely no sense. Eventually, Reginald simply abandoned the case, leaving John without any defense at all. Although, by general admission, he did him a favor with this act, since another lawyer, upon learning about this, felt sorry for John Lee and volunteered to represent the butler's interests in court. Given that the new lawyer didn't even have time to properly prepare for the trial, his good intentions could not save the defendant from a guilty verdict. Due to the lack of experience, the lawyer was unable to win the case. The jury, having heard the witnesses, the prosecutor, and the defense, went to deliberate. It took them less than an hour to come to a unanimous decision and return with a verdict: guilty. John Henry George Lee was sentenced to death by hanging. For the next 3 months, the butler spent his time in a prison cell, terrified, awaiting execution. All this time, he insisted on his innocence and shouted that God would protect him from an unjust sentence. Finally, on February 23, 1885, the day of John's execution arrived. For most people, it was just an ordinary day, except that the execution never took place. The executioner, a man named James Barry, had sent criminals to the other world for many years. He had checked the gallows and the trapdoor where the villain falls through after the sentence is read, and the signal for the execution to begin in advance as required. Everything functioned precisely, like clockwork. John Lee appeared before a crowd of onlookers eager to see the murderer who had killed the elderly mistress of Glen Manor give up his soul to God. John prayed for the last time, remembering how Emma had taught him to do it, closing his eyes. The priest, standing on the scaffold not far from the gallows, also finished his ritual. When all the preparations were completed, a bag was put over John's head and a rope around his neck. He was led to the trapdoor and the executioner pulled the lever. The spectators, holding their breath, waited for the criminal's last whimper and the crunch of breaking vertebrae. But nothing happened. The trapdoor did not open. The executioner looked at the gallows in bewilderment, not understanding what was happening. As soon as John and the priest were led away from the trapdoor in the floor and asked to go downstairs, the structure opened. Everything was working fine. They decided to start the execution again. The butler was asked to say his last words. The bag was pulled over his head, the noose, and he was led to the trapdoor. The priest prayed again for the salvation of the soul of God's servant. The executioner pulled the lever, and again nothing happened. As soon as John Lee stood on the trapdoor, said goodbye to life, the gallows stopped working. The crowd began to cross themselves and whisper. The execution device was checked again for malfunctions, but the gallows were in order, and it seemed that nothing could prevent justice from being carried out. For the third time, John Lee was led to the scaffold. For the third time, he was prepared for execution. For the third time, he said goodbye to life and again remained unharmed. In the end, after the third failure, it was decided to cancel the execution. It was up to the judge to decide what to do with the prisoner who could not be hanged 3 times. Trying to execute John a 4th time would be inhumane. Therefore, the death sentence against him was commuted to life imprisonment, which lasted only 22 years. From prison, the unjustly convicted butler continued to write petitions to the judge to review the case due to his innocence, and on September 18, 1907, John Henry George Lee was finally released for good behavior. None of this made any sense until one day, 6 years after Emma Keyse's death, the bitter truth was revealed. More precisely, it became known much later. By that time, John was still serving his sentence in a prison cell, and everyone had long forgotten about him. In 1890, a group of people from high society, including politicians, lawyers, and other wealthy individuals, gathered at a cemetery near Glen Manor to say goodbye to a very important and respected man who had died after slowly going insane. When the priest finished the funeral rite, the mourners threw a few handfuls of earth into the grave and slowly began to disperse. Someone from the gathered whispered to another that perhaps today they had buried a criminal. Here is what, in the opinion of many, actually happened on the night of November 15, 1884, when Emma Keyse was brutally murdered. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like this video. It's really important. Elizabeth's pregnancy, John Lee's sister, could have turned into a scandal not only for herself, but also for the father of her unborn child. He was also worried about his reputation and nervous about what society would think when they found out about his child out of wedlock, especially with someone else's maid. Only Elizabeth knew who this man was, but despite the threat of exposure, the father of the future baby did not want to give up his meetings with the pretty girl. He did not try to distance himself from Elizabeth in any way, but continued to sneak into her room when everyone was asleep. On that fateful night after the dinner party at Glen, which he also attended, the child's father decided to sneak into the manor under the cover of darkness to see his pregnant lover. Emma, the mistress of the estate, was still awake, although she had long since dismissed the servants. She was sitting in the living room, drinking cold cocoa and rereading old letters when she heard someone's cautious steps in the corridor. The woman put down the letter, placed the half-empty cup on the table, and went to see who was walking around at such a late hour. In the hallway, Emma came face to face with a man she had known for many years. He was coming out of the bedroom of the young cook, Elizabeth. Her religious and conservative nature could not tolerate such audacity. The woman instantly understood everything. She was so offended and angry that she started yelling at the night guest. The mistress threatened to tell the whole world about his escapades and illicit affair if he did not leave her house immediately and forget the way there, and then Emma approached the man and gave him a loud slap. At this moment, the face of the uninvited guest was distorted with malice. He snarled and flew into a rage. Instead of leaving, he started attacking Emma, and then grabbed an axe hanging on the wall near the pantry and brought it down right on the mistress's head. She collapsed to the floor as if cut down, but was still breathing and continued to silently gasp for air. Seeing the blood on his hands, the man came to his senses and realized what he had done. He understood that now his secret would be revealed. He would fall out of favor with society and lose his job. Even worse, he would go to jail for assaulting a person. Emma Keyse had to die to take his secret with her. In a moment of panic, the perpetrator ran to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and finished his dirty work, finally knocking the spirit out of Emma Keyse. When she stopped showing signs of life, the man dragged her body back to the dining room where she usually read before bed. Then he doused the entire house with flammable oil, which was stored in the pantry where John slept, and started a fire to cover up the traces of the crime. The man didn't even notice the sleeping butler when he grabbed the oil from the shelf. Then the murderer ran out of the house, and for the next 6 years was tormented by the realization of the gravity of his wrongdoing. He suffered so much from having taken the life of his friend Emma Keyse that he almost sent Elizabeth and his unborn child to the next world as well. He began to go insane. Mental health problems led to a deterioration in his physical health. He stopped eating, getting up, recognizing his loved ones. As he lay on his deathbed, the man began to rave about things that had occupied his thoughts for the past 6 years. He spoke of the terrible death of a woman close to him who lived in a large, beautiful estate by the sea, of a fire that consumed the traces of the crime, of his child who was to be born. In essence, he confessed to the murder of Emma Keyse. His family and friends heard this, but it took them a while to connect the dying man's delirium with real events in his life. That's why people at his funeral were whispering, calling him a murderer. This man was none other than the lawyer Reginald Templer. Now no one will ever know whether he took on John Lee's case because he felt guilty and wanted to keep an innocent man out of prison, or whether he simply wanted to sabotage the case to have guarantees that he himself would not end up behind bars. Although it was during this trial that Reginald began to fall into the madness that ultimately led to his death. There are several different versions regarding John Lee's extraordinary escape from the gallows. Of course, the most religious and trusting people considered it divine intervention for wanting to hang an innocent man. God did not allow another crime to be committed, but this was nothing more than an illusion. There was another version related to God's providence. Only the Holy Father, who accompanied the criminal on the scaffold, unwittingly acted as the savior. When building the gallows, the carpenter accidentally broke one board. When pressure was applied to it, it blocked the latch mechanism, preventing it from working. When the priest ascended the scaffold during the execution and stood in his designated place, it created pressure on the broken board, and it jammed the entire structure. When testing the mechanism, the clergyman descended from the scaffold and the trapdoor opened freely. Thus, divine intervention consisted only in the fact that the Holy Father, without knowing it, was blocking the hatch. Another reason why the gallows malfunctioned every time John stood on the wooden doors was that when the scaffold was moved from one place to another, the drawbar was slightly displaced. As a result, the loops of the hatch got stuck when they were pressed by a weight. And there were several such versions. An alternative theory suggested that the trap was blocked by a wooden wedge that was inserted by an inmate working on the scaffold and removed when the device was tested, but confirmation of this theory was not found. Some said that John knew about the mistake of the carpenter who made the scaffold. If you stand on it in a certain way, the flaps will not open. Others argued that the wooden trap doors had swollen slightly from moisture. When someone stood on them, they would jam, but if there was no weight, they would open easily. Based on the story of the lawyer Reginald Templer, John was indeed an innocent man and did not deserve to die. Having spent 22 years in prison, John Lee became famous as a man who could not be hanged. After his release, the former prisoner even performed in public several times, telling about his life. A silent film was made about his divine salvation from the gallows. A book was written about this incredible case, and even a rock opera was created where the main character miraculously avoids being hanged 3 times. Information about John Lee's whereabouts after 1916 varies slightly in different sources. There is documentary evidence that after his release from prison, John Lee married and emigrated to America, where he lived a happy and peaceful life until he died at the age of 81. The case, where thanks to some amazing coincidence, a person sentenced to death was able to stay alive, has gone down in the history of the crime genre. "82-year-old Gwendolyn Mitchell Hill, a lonely widow, lived in a small apartment on Military Road, the main street of Mosman, a suburb of Sydney. On March 1st, 1989, around noon, she left her apartment to go to local shops. After spending a few hours shopping, Gwendolyn was happily walking home. Although she had bought almost nothing, the elderly woman was in good spirits. It was around 4:00 p.m. when Gwendolyn approached the front door of her own apartment. It was at this moment that she was brutally attacked. Several boys, who were staying with a family in the apartment building where Mitchell Hill lived, were about to go home when they stumbled upon a body lying in a pool of blood. Gwendolyn was barely alive and visibly shaking. The boys recognized the sweet old lady who always treated them with candies and cookies whenever she met them in the entrance or on the street, and now she obviously needed help. Not knowing what to do, the schoolboys rushed back upstairs to the apartment they had left a couple of minutes ago and told the owners that their elderly neighbor had fallen and hit her head. 2 adult women, along with the teenagers, immediately went down a couple of floors to help Gwendolyn get up. But the elderly lady was so seriously injured that she was completely disoriented. She had no idea what was going on and did not recognize any of those present. The woman thought that the attacker had returned to finish his dirty work, so she tried to fight off her rescuers. The neighbors realized that this was clearly not just a fall and called the police. Officers who arrived at the scene found that Mitchell Hill's open handbag was lying next to her body. A significant amount of cash had been taken from it. The police also noticed that the victim's underwear and stockings had been removed, but there were no signs of any intimate violence. The victim was immediately taken to the hospital. Unfortunately, Gwendolyn Mitchell Hill did not survive the attack and died that same night. The autopsy confirmed the neighbors' grim guess. Gwendolyn had not simply fallen and hit her head. The pathologist found a lacerated wound on the back of the skull, as well as a midline fracture. Even assuming that the woman had actually fallen, it would have been a very rare fall, simply backward, without any attempt to change the position of the body or turn the head. Because of this, the pathologist believed that she had been hit on the back of the head with a blunt, heavy object. Unfortunately, the attack on Gwendolyn turned out to be too difficult a crime for the police. Despite the fact that she lived on a busy central street of the city, right opposite an active construction site, there were no witnesses to the attack. No one saw or heard anything. In addition, the neighbors who lived in the apartment building of Mitchell Hill did a good deed and washed the staircase from blood, considering everything an accident. So the police had no forensic evidence, no witness statements, and no leads as to what had happened to the elderly lady. And 2 months later, the criminal struck again. Friends, over 90% of viewers watch videos without subscribing to the channel. Check if you're subscribed. If not, please be so kind as to subscribe to the channel to support me. On May 9, 1989, Lady Winifreda Ashton, widow of the Anglo-Austrian Impressionist artist Sir John William Ashton, wrapped up her club after a bingo game lunch and was walking home along Military Road to the next street. On the way, the woman looked into a couple of stores and was already ready to go upstairs home when she was attacked right in the lobby of the apartment building. The criminal repeatedly hit the woman with something like a hammer. Then, when she fell, he dragged the body into a small niche where a trash can stood and hit her head several more times on the concrete floor. Police found Winifreda Ashton lying face down next to the trash can. Her bare legs were crossed and her arms outstretched at her sides. She was wearing a red raincoat. Her cane and shoes were neatly folded next to the body. Her underwear and stockings had been removed. In fact, Ashton's death was not the result of blows with a heavy object, but of strangulation with her own stockings. They were pulled so tightly around her neck that they cut into her skin. The elderly lady's entire face was bruised, and a thin trickle of blood flowed from her mouth. Her purse was missing, but a noticeable diamond ring was worn on one of her fingers. The motive of robbery was immediately questioned. It was unlikely that the thief would leave the jewelry, encroaching only on the purse. Apparently, he was pursuing another goal. The ubiquitous reporters immediately linked the violent death of Lady Winifreda Ashton to the recent death of another elderly woman, Gwendolyn Mitchell Hill, and notified the whole city that a maniac was operating, attacking affluent elderly ladies. Despite the fact that there were still no real clues, the police had to start a large-scale investigation. The problem was that they were looking for a needle in a haystack. Law enforcement officers inspected more than 2,000 homes in Mosman in an attempt to find at least something, searching a huge area. The result of these unsuccessful attempts was only a description of an unremarkable man who aroused suspicion among local residents. According to several witnesses, he was an unkempt man with disheveled hair and rotten teeth. His appearance was very repulsive, so it was remembered by several eyewitnesses. But could this homeless-looking passerby have anything to do with the crimes? At the moment, it was not possible to find out. The similarity of the situation between the sudden death of the two elderly women was also in the fact that the zealous neighbors cleaned up the crime scene. And in the fact that the zealous neighbors cleaned up the crime scene, destroying all possible evidence. The detectives, frankly not understanding where to look for the perpetrator, turned to a forensic psychiatrist with a request to compile a psychological profile of the attacker. The expert's conclusion presented the police with the following psychological and behavioral profile. It could be a young or middle-aged man who lived in the Military Road area. It is possible that he had a military background. Most likely in his life there were some special relationships with an important woman for him, which influenced his psyche. The expert did not exclude the possibility that the perpetrator could also be a high school student or a college student, since there were several educational institutions nearby in this area. In addition, both crimes occurred during the daytime. The police talked to the management of nearby schools and took note of all suspicious teenagers. About a month after the incident, a passerby found Winifreda's empty wallet in Ashton Park, named after the deceased husband of the second victim. The police searched the entire park area but found nothing else there. A few months later, on October 18, 1989, 86-year-old Doris Cox was on her way to her retirement village. This is what places in Australia are called where elderly people who have reached a certain age spend their old age. It is a community of retirees united by common interests. They lead a fairly active lifestyle, hold joint events, and socialize. In retirement villages, there are social workers who look after elderly patients and help them in everyday life. It was in such a place that Doris Cox, who had lost her husband, lived. Her path lay along a secluded staircase in front of her house, surrounded by a brick fence. The elderly lady did not expect anything bad because she was in a familiar place where there are plenty of her friends. It was there that the perpetrator caught up with her, grabbing her from behind by the hair and hitting her head against the brickwork. Doris fell to the ground and lost consciousness. When the residents of the village found the woman, she was urgently taken to the hospital. She survived. However, the well-meaning neighbors washed away the traces of blood on the rocky path. Not wanting to leave the hospital, Doris recalled the unpleasant incident. And again, by the irony of fate, all possible forensic evidence from the crime scene was erased. It was only the next day after the incident that doctors suspected that Doris had not just hit her head, losing her balance. That is why they called the police sergeant, who was working on the two previous cases involving attacks on elderly ladies. One of the main investigators in the case, as soon as he was called and informed about Doris Cox, rushed to the hospital, well aware that a real clue had finally appeared. After the neighbors washed away the evidence from the crime scene and casual passers-by did not notice anything suspicious, it was a real stroke of luck. After all, the victim could remember and describe the appearance of the perpetrator. However, as it turned out, his joy was premature. Unfortunately, Doris Cox suffered from senile dementia, so she could not help the police. In fact, she had no idea what had happened to her or how she ended up in the hospital at all. Despite all the efforts of the police, it was not possible to find out anything new about the criminal. But this time, the public showed vigilance. Several people came to the police with a statement. They drew attention to a young guy riding a skateboard near the retirement village at about the same time when the attack on Doris Cox occurred. Thanks to the descriptions of several witnesses, a composite sketch of the alleged criminal was compiled and published in the mass media. Over the next few weeks, police tried unsuccessfully to track down this guy, responding to numerous reports from citizens. On November 2nd, at about 10 kilometers from Mossman, 78-year-old Dorothy Bank was returning home from shopping along a quiet, deserted street when she was approached by a stranger. The man seemed very polite and friendly to the pensioner. He offered to help the woman carry the groceries home. She agreed. Wanting to somehow thank the kind person, Dorothy invited him to stay and have a cup of tea. But the man refused. But just a few minutes later, walking along the same deaf alley, this man came across Margaret Pahut, an 85-year-old widow, slowly stepping towards the house. The stranger turned around and followed her. Choosing a secluded place where the lane was overgrown with bushes and trees, the man brutally attacked Margaret from behind, hitting her on the head with something heavy. He carefully took off the woman's underwear and stockings and put the cane and shoes next to the body. Again, there were no witnesses nearby. No one saw how it happened and did not hear any suspicious sounds or blows. Margaret lay right in the middle of the street in a pool of her own blood until a schoolgirl returning after classes noticed a pile of rags lying in the middle of the road. The girl came closer and immediately recoiled in horror. She ran home to her apartment and told her mother about the terrible incident. The woman who had heard about the attacks on grandmothers immediately called the police and an ambulance. When she approached the victim, she was barely breathing. Margaret died in the ambulance. This time, the evidence from the crime scene was destroyed by the untimely rain. The autopsy showed that Margaret Pahut's death was caused by severe head injuries inflicted by an unknown object. Again, no wallet was found on her. Everything coincided with the cases of the previous victims, as well as the fact that there were no witnesses to the incident nearby. This time, neither the homeless man nor the young man with the skateboard were seen. The investigation was stalled in one place, and the number of victims was steadily growing. Along with this, the detectives were under tremendous pressure from the police department, the media, and the public. They had to solve this case before the criminal struck again, and another elderly lady was hurt. The media dubbed the criminal the grandmother exterminator. Panic was growing in the city. Women were afraid to go out on the city streets. The most terrible thing was that the maniac attacked lonely old women who did not have relatives or family nearby, and they were forced to go shopping and to the pharmacy on their own. Despite the fact that the police worked around the clock on this case and, occasionally taking a short break for sleep, the next crime did not take long to happen. On November 3rd in the afternoon, 81-year-old Olive Cleveland was sitting on a bench near the retirement village in Belrose, another suburb of Sydney. The elderly lady was just enjoying the view of the surroundings and breathing fresh air when an unknown man sat down on the bench next to her. He tried to strike up a conversation, but Olive, who had heard about the attacks, felt an unpleasant chill down her spine at the sight of a stranger. She felt uncomfortable, so the elderly lady quietly got up and walked towards the main building of the village. The strange interlocutor soon caught up with the woman, quietly coming up from behind. He forced her to go down the ramp into a secluded side alley, where he hit her several times on the back of the head with a heavy object before taking off her stockings and tightly tying them around her neck. The tension was so strong that the material of the stockings got stuck in the woman's neck, cutting the skin. Then the attacker rummaged through Cleveland's handbag, took out $60 from there, and neatly put the handbag, shoes, and cane next to the body. When the staff of the retirement village found the lifeless body, they decided that the woman had awkwardly fallen and tied the stockings around her neck instead of a scarf. Placing the remains in a small morgue on the territory of the village, they washed away the blood remaining on the ground with water from a hose. As soon as the detectives received information about another death of an elderly woman, they were completely disappointed. The police officers sincerely did not understand how it was possible to clear the crime scene when from every TV set and from the front pages of newspapers they talked about the terrible attacks. Instead of paying attention to the victim and the state in which she was found, the workers of the village simply put things in order on their territory. Meanwhile, criminologists tried to identify a pattern in all 4 crimes and understand the mindset of the attacker. The use of the victim's stockings as a murder weapon clearly hinted at the need of the perpetrator to humiliate the victim in an intimate way. The use of excessive force at the same time indicated that there was something personal in the incidents and some dissatisfaction. That is, the process itself clearly caused some hidden desires in the criminal, but the fact that the victims were not subjected to sexual intercourse obliged the killer to do everything neatly, which is typical for people who had something to do with military training. This is how the psychiatrist explained the actions of the old lady exterminator. The next day, November 4th, an official task force was set up to investigate particularly serious crimes. The team included 70 people, including investigators, district detectives, intelligence officers, computer analysis experts, and forensic experts. Some members of the task force worked 20 hours a day. The state government offered a $200,000 reward for any information that could lead to the solution of this complex case. Police held public meetings where they instructed older citizens on personal safety issues. Undercover officers posed as gardeners and workers in retirement villages. Patrols on city streets were stepped up. Due to the wide coverage of this case in the media, hundreds of concerned citizens called the police and expressed their own assumptions. Officers checked almost every call, but nothing concrete was found out. And even the enhanced security measures did not stop the criminal. On November 23rd, he struck again. 93-year-old widow Muriel Falconer had lived alone for the last 39 years in her large house in Mosman. This independent woman, despite her advanced age, was completely self-confident. She could easily not lock the front door at night, as she was convinced that if a burglar needed to get inside, he would do it. And so she would just give him the money, and that's it. Who needs to get rid of a half-blind and deaf old woman? Morel believed. Her neighbor Maggie has repeatedly tried to convince the elderly lady to be careful, but she just waved her off like an annoying fly. On November 23rd, Muriel took a walk to the local store. She was tired of sitting alone within four walls. A trip to the grocery store was a kind of entertainment for her, where the pensioner could exchange a couple of phrases with the salespeople, chat with one of the neighbors, and just stretch her legs. The woman returned home around 5 o'clock in the evening. She had already unlocked the front door and entered the house when suddenly her mouth was covered with a gloved hand. And then Muriel's head almost split from a strong blow. As it turned out, there were several blows to the head and neck, but the elderly hostess of the house passed out immediately and no longer felt how she was being beaten with something heavy. She regained consciousness when the criminal began to take off her stockings and underwear. Muriel tried to scream and call for help, but the attacker hit her again, after which he still took off her stockings, wrapped them around her neck, finishing his dirty work. The perpetrator walked around the house, looking at what to profit from, but took only $100 from his victim's handbag. With a gesture that was already familiar, he neatly put his shoes and handbag next to the body and quietly left the house. Neighbor Maggie, knowing Muriel's unbreakable stubbornness, visited her every day. The woman even had spare keys to the house. Maggie immediately sensed something was wrong when she noticed an untouched lunch on the porch that was delivered daily to the elderly lady. It was already difficult for her to do housework because of her age. Using the spare key, neighbor Maggie entered the house and saw a picture that she had more than once described to Muriel, trying to protect her from leaving the house. This is exactly what the crime scene looked like, described in the news. The mistress of the house was lying lifelessly face down in a pool of her own blood, and her shoes were standing next to her. Maggie, unlike other kind-hearted neighbors, did not touch anything. She went home and called the police. Thanks to her competent actions, the detectives finally had physical evidence left by the criminal. These were bloody footprints on the carpet, and although the traces were not very clear, they could tell a lot about the person who wore such shoes. Part of the carpet with the prints was cut out and sent to the forensic laboratory. The experts were able to completely reconstruct the sole. And what was the surprise of the police officers when they learned that such shoes are not worn by young people? They are usually bought by middle-aged or elderly people. When investigators went around the neighborhood to question possible witnesses, one of the neighbors said that he had seen an unfamiliar, respectable middle-aged man not far from Muriel Falconer's house, but with gray hair. The stranger was dressed in a gray suit with a silvery sheen. By Christmas, the reward for helping to catch the criminal had been increased to $250,000. The police kept secret from the media all the information that had come to light, so that they would not accidentally scare off the perpetrator. Meanwhile, they checked unsolved cases over the past 6 months involving a gray-haired man, and indeed came across something interesting. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like this video. It's really important. One of the police reports mentioned the name of an 85-year-old woman named Margaret Todhunter. She was walking down the street when she was approached by a middle-aged man with gray hair who hit her in the face and snatched her purse. The woman survived, but she had to have 8 stitches as a result of the attack. At the time of the investigation, She was living in the state of Queensland. Detectives flew there specifically to meet with her and ask a few questions. Margaret was able to give them a fairly accurate description of the criminal who had attacked her and, presumably, had massacred several other elderly ladies. She said that he was about 50 years old, about 175 tall. He had completely gray hair, a strong build, broad shoulders, a powerful chest, and a large belly. At that time, he was wearing a white shirt in a business style and cream-colored trousers. Based on the description, experts were able to make a sketch of the suspect. Another unsolved case that interested detectives involved 82-year-old Euphemia Carney, who on August 25, 1989, was returning to her home in a retirement village. A gray-haired man who appeared literally out of nowhere approached her, punched her in the chest, and snatched her purse. The woman managed to notice how he got into a blue car and drove away. After that, Euphemia had to treat the bruises on her chest and a head injury from the fall for a long time. The woman was also able to provide the police with a detailed description of the perpetrator, completely coinciding with Margaret's story. Statements and unsolved cases about the strange behavior of a gray-haired man poured in like a cornucopia. The police had several complaints from patients of a nursing home, where a middle-aged man, with hair as white as snow, inappropriately touched elderly ladies, stroked their buttocks, lifted up their nightgowns, and touched their breasts. Now the police had more than enough descriptions of the alleged criminal, but the question of where to look for him was still acute. Meanwhile, on January 11, 1990, an elderly patient at Greenwich Hospital named Daisy Roberts was attacked again. A man, dressed in work clothes and with a clipboard in his hand, entered the oncology ward of the hospital, where there were 4 elderly patients, including 82-year-old Daisy Roberts, with advanced cancer. The gray-haired man, claiming to be a doctor, put his hands under Daisy's nightgown and touched her in an indecent way. The pensioner panicked and called for help by pressing the nurse call button located above the bed. The stranger managed to run out the door, but the nurse did not get confused and followed where he ran. The strange man got into a car and disappeared. But the hospital employee managed to write down the registration number of his car and reported it to the police. As often happens, the brigade that arrived on the call had nothing to do with the investigation of the attacks of the grandmother exterminator. The hospital staff recognized the escaped man as a local pie seller named John Wayne Glover. When the police went to his home to ask a few questions, this man refused to talk without his lawyer. He promised to come to the police station the next day with a lawyer, but never showed up. Glover's wife reported that he had tried to commit suicide because of the ridiculous accusations against him and was now in the hospital. When 2 officers arrived at the medical facility, the doctor did not allow them to see the patient, referring to his unstable behavior. But he handed the law enforcement officers Glover's suicide note, which said that no more old ladies. The man addressed his wife and said that it all started with Essie. The next day, Glover again refused to answer questions from the police, citing a lawyer, but allowed himself to be photographed. The man admitted that he was indeed at Greenwich Hospital that day, but said nothing more. Daisy Roberts recognized the person posing as a doctor in the photo. The nurse also confirmed that it was he who ran out of the ward of seriously ill women. Because the officers handling Daisy Roberts' case did not immediately link the 2 crimes, Glover's suicide note and photo were handed over to the task force handling the grandma exterminator case only 2 weeks later. He rejected all accusations, since the police had no concrete evidence. They decided not to question him about the fatal attacks. Around-the-clock surveillance was set up on Glover in the hope that he himself would make some mistake. John Wayne Glover was born on November 26, 1932 in England, into an ordinary working-class family. His parents divorced, and his mother began to constantly have different men. At the age of 14, he dropped out of school and earned money for living by stealing clothes and bags. Because of this, he began to have problems with the law. To avoid prison, John enlisted in the military but was quickly expelled from there when they learned about the crimes. In 1957, Glover immigrated to Australia and settled in Melbourne. Soon he took up his old ways and was convicted of indecent assaults on women with bodily harm and for theft. In 1968, he met his wife and moved to the Sydney suburb of Mosman, to his wife's parents' home. Glover always had problematic relationships with women older than him. It all started with his mother, who got married more than 5 times, and the rest of the time she met with new admirers. With Essie, John's mother-in-law, the relationship also did not work out from the first meeting. With each new day, the hostility between them only intensified. Glover had to endure Essie's open dislike because he lived in her house. Glover's mother moved to Australia in 1976. She died in 1989. Later, in the same year, John was also diagnosed with breast cancer, and he had a second mastectomy. After that, he began to have problems with potency. John's mother-in-law, Essie, also died. Before the man began to carry out his massacres of single pensioners in the late 80s, he was a volunteer in the Elderly Society and was considered a friendly and trustworthy person. He was married, had 2 daughters, and lived a normal life in Mosman. His wife was an administrator in one of the nursing homes. Lately, Glover worked as a sales representative in a meat pie company. His working day began early in the morning and ended after noon, so all the crimes were committed during the daytime. For work, the man often went to different suburbs of Sydney, where he committed his attacks. By March 19, 1990, surveillance of Glover had been going on for 6 weeks. On that day, the man called in sick at work. He himself bought a bottle of whiskey and around 10 a.m. headed to the house of his friend, 60-year-old divorced Joan Sinclair. The observers took up positions near the house and waited. Hours passed, but there was no movement in the house. The surveillance team became concerned, and around 6 p.m. received permission to enter the house. The police officers knocked on the front door, but no one answered. Then they walked around the building, looked inside through the glass back door, and saw a hammer lying in a pool of dried blood on the mat. The officers opened the door slightly and saw the mistress's lifeless body. They immediately called the task force. Joan Sinclair's head was smashed in and stockings were tied around her neck. The hammer lying nearby turned out to be the instrument of the crimes committed by Glover earlier. He wrapped it in something like a towel, which changed the nature of the blood splatters. That's why the investigators could not establish what was used to strike the victims' heads. John Glover was found unconscious in a filled bathtub. The man had made another attempt to leave this world. He had swallowed a handful of pills, washing them down with alcohol, and then, just in case, decided to cut his left wrist. His life was saved by the fact that the mixture of whiskey and medicine caused severe vomiting. When he was found, he was barely breathing. The next day in the hospital, when Glover came to his senses, he confessed to the detectives that he had taken the lives of elderly women who resembled his mother-in-law, Essie. As it turned out, John, in addition to everything else, had finally lost interest in women. Therefore, this whole ritual with underwear was nothing more than a spectacle designed to humiliate the dignity of the victims. With the stolen money, he bought drinks for himself and his friends, spent part of the money on slot machines, and just wasted it on all sorts of nonsense. During a search of Glover's house, shoes were found that matched the footprints left at the crime scene in Muriel Falconer's home. The man was charged with taking the life of Joan Sinclair and placed in custody. Then, together with the detectives, Glover went to the crime scenes and told in detail how he had stalked and sent his victims to the next world. On March 28, 1990, 57-year-old John Wayne Glover was officially charged with the deaths of 6 elderly women, as well as a series of attacks. His trial began on November 18, 1991. According to a psychiatrist, Glover had been accumulating hostility and aggression towards his mother since childhood, and then towards his mother-in-law, who felt it and responded with the same dislike, thereby provoking his anger to come out. But Glover held on as best he could. After all, she was his wife's mother. When she died, he had to vent his accumulated aggression on someone else. After the death of Joan Sinclair, the criminal realized that his actions no longer brought him the relief he had experienced at the beginning, and the police would sooner or later find evidence of his involvement in all these deaths. The defense tried to use this explanation for John's actions to mitigate the sentence, but judging by his calmness, he hardly regretted anything. The prosecutor made it clear that all the defendant's actions were planned in advance. He carried gardening gloves in the trunk of his car so as not to leave clues, and a hammer, which he cleaned with acid after each crime. The jury deliberated for several hours before finding him guilty. The judge sentenced John Glover to the maximum term of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Despite the verdict, detectives believed that the convicted man could have been involved in a number of other serious crimes. But this is unlikely to ever be known, as John Glover took this secret with him to the grave. On September 10, 2005, he was found dead in his prison cell. It was confirmed that the 72-year-old serial criminal exterminator of grandmothers had hanged himself. Houston, Texas, April 16, 1997. Shortly after 9 o'clock in the evening, Robert Angleton and his twin daughters, Nicole and Alexandra, were hurrying home after a softball game. The man was worried about his wife, Doris. She had gone to retrieve a special baseball bat that the girls had forgotten in the backyard, but hadn't returned. Robert didn't know what to think. He genuinely feared that something terrible had happened to his spouse. Doris fully understood how important the sports equipment was to her daughters during the game. However, for some reason, the woman never brought it. Doris was a caring mother, and such behavior was uncharacteristic of her. She never missed her girls' softball games. The head of the family, Robert, along with the twins, left the car in front of an alarming and frightening scene at their home in River Oaks. Doris's car was parked in the driveway, and the back door to the house was open. However, the woman was not answering phone calls. Robert wanted to enter the house to find out the reason for his wife's strange behavior. But Nicole and Alexandra clung to their father in panic, begging him to call the police instead. They feared that there might be a robber inside and worried that their father could get hurt. Instead of going inside, Robert sat back in his car and dialed the emergency number 911. A few minutes later, the arriving officers approached the back door of the Angleton residence. With weapons at the ready, they climbed the steps and entered. Cautiously, step by step, treading on the tiled floor of the hallway leading to the kitchen, one officer accidentally kicked a shell casing and heard it roll across the floor. That's when he looked down, and something unclear caught his attention. Moving closer, the patrol officers could see a woman's body sprawled on the floor. It appeared that she had been shot several times in the head and chest. One of the officers crouched beside the victim and checked for a pulse. Judging by the number of shell casings scattered nearby, the 46-year-old homeowner simply had no chance of survival. She was dead. While the husband and daughters outside prayed fervently, hoping for a happy outcome, the law enforcement officers standing over the body of the homeowner pondered how to inform the family about the tragedy. Robert Angleton's reaction to the news of his wife's demise was unpredictable. Upon learning that Doris was no longer alive, the man ran out into the front yard and began pacing around with his hands raised above his head. He screamed and cried, unable to contain his emotions. For a moment, he probably forgot that his daughters were watching what was happening from the car. Later that evening, relatives took the girls away, and Robert had to go to the police station to give a statement. Initially, detectives assumed that they were dealing with a failed robbery. Perhaps the kidnappers did not expect one of the owners to return to the house at that moment and, frightened, opened fire. However, this theory had to be discarded. There were no signs of a break-in, and the alarm system was simply turned off. Everything in the house was in its place. Drawers were not pulled out, and nothing was missing. There was a safe upstairs, but its contents were also in perfect order. Bearer bonds were still lying on top of the safe. Investigators believed that Doris was shot shortly after she entered the house. She was attacked either as she was entering or as she was about to leave. Friends, over 90% of viewers watch videos without subscribing to the channel. Check if you're subscribed. If not, please be so kind as to subscribe to the channel to support me. The lifeless body was found right in the middle of the hallway. Doris had indeed entered through the front door, placed her purse on the console to the right, and proceeded through the corridor to the kitchen. It was there, apparently, that the criminal's bullets caught up with her. Detectives analyzed the bullet wounds and pieced together a probable scenario. It seemed that the first 1 or 2 shots knocked Doris off her feet. She fell and remained lying on the floor as the perpetrator approached and pointed the weapon directly at her head, firing several more shots. The police collected 13 .22 caliber shell casings. This was clearly overkill for taking one person's life. The perpetrator kept shooting until he ran out of bullets just to make sure the victim was dead. Tracing the bullet's trajectory, the detectives concluded that 2 guns were involved, but only one shooter. And even if they had found the murder weapon, ballistic analysis would not have been able to establish an exact match. The fact was that the bullets fired at Doris were frangible. They simply shattered into pieces, leaving no grooves or anything similar that could be compared. At the crime scene, investigators examined all surfaces for fingerprints, traces, or clues that the attackers might have left behind, but their search was unsuccessful. The person who sent Doris to the other world managed to escape unnoticed. Meanwhile, at the police station, Robert Angleton recounted how his family had spent the day and what had preceded the unfolding tragedy. That evening, he and the girls had arrived at the playing field around 7:45 p.m. They were practicing when Doris's car pulled up. The woman, in excellent spirits, got out of the vehicle and waved to her husband and daughters. She informed Robert that she would stop by the house to change clothes and return to watch the upcoming game. In their haste, the girls had forgotten their lucky baseball bat in the backyard, where they had practiced the day before. Robert asked Doris to grab it as well. The woman promised not to be long, but the game started, and she still hadn't shown up. Worried, Robert scanned all the stands and, not finding his wife, called her but got no response. And when he returned home, he found the back door open. That's when he immediately called the police. The detectives suggested that Bob try to think of anyone who might have had a grudge against Doris. The man pondered, sifting through thoughts in his head, and then unexpectedly asked the police to turn off the tape recording of the interrogation. Robert made a shocking confession. Angleton informed the detectives that he was a bookmaker, and not just a bookmaker, he ran one of the largest sports betting operations in Texas. Handling $40 to $60 million a year, the man got a good percentage of those sums. Robert was able to succeed in this business mainly because his clients were very, very wealthy people. Oil tycoons, doctors, lawyers, those who could afford to place large bets on sporting events. Moreover, bookmaking wasn't Robert's only occupation. For the past 10 years, he had been a key informant in the Vice Division of the Houston Police Department, which was supposed to monitor other bookmakers' compliance with the law. After Robert Angleton's confession, the detectives decided that the attack on Doris might have been somehow related to his bookmaking activities. Now they had to find out who could have been angry enough at Robert to take his wife's life. Considering disgruntled players and every bookie whose business had been ruined by Robert, the police had a whole list of suspects. Although perhaps the reasons were not related to Robert at all. A few days after Doris's tragic demise, the residents of Houston still couldn't recover from the shock. Everyone was stunned. It wasn't too often that a wealthy, relatively well-known woman was killed in her own home, in an area like River Oaks. River Oaks is the wealthiest place to live in Houston. It's a residential community where property values range from $1 million to over $20 million. River Oaks Boulevard, the road that runs through the center of the community, is surrounded on both sides by mansions and estates set back from the street. There are about 1,600 single-family detached homes. Given the cost of real estate in the area, some of Houston's most affluent people live there. Socialites, undoubtedly including a woman like Doris Angleton, hardly fit the role of a crime victim. There was no one who, having met Doris once, did not succumb to the charm of her grace, charisma, and sociability. Doris Angleton grew up with her brother and sister in a small town, graduated from the University of Texas with a degree in speech therapy, and began a career as a school teacher before later becoming a pharmaceutical sales representative. Despite the fact that her upbringing and education were very different from that of her husband, whose father was a real estate tycoon and a successful multimillionaire, the woman was able to capture Robert Angleton's attention. When the future spouses first met, they were both already married. The self-assured Robert, without hesitation, approached Doris's husband and said that if he ever decided to get rid of his beautiful wife, he should let him know. Sometime later, both couples divorced and Doris and Robert began dating. In May 1982, they got married and settled in River Oaks. Doris was very taken with Robert. Not only was he a very charming man, but he was also constantly striving for success. 2 years later, the Angletons had twin girls, Nicole and Alexandra. Money never seemed to be a problem for their family. Robert's bookmaking business brought in about $2 million a year, all in cash. Also, in addition to sports betting, the head of the family was involved in other businesses. Robert bought several shopping centers, several restaurants, and had a used car dealership. Money was flowing. Most people in Doris's circle had no idea how Robert made his millions. When Doris confessed to a friend that her husband was a bookmaker, the friend thought he had something to do with books. For almost 10 years, Robert's business thrived, largely thanks to the Houston police, who turned a blind eye to his criminal activities in exchange for information about all the other bookmaking operations in the city. Angleton turned in other bookmakers so that the Vice Squad could arrest them. The police department made arrests and improved statistics, and for Robert, it was a great way to eliminate competition and protect his livelihood. However, there were other troubles in his life. Doris didn't want her husband to engage in illegal business. The fact was that in some states, betting, gambling, and gambling were strictly prohibited. Bookmaking was considered illegal. Doris was actually most concerned about the impact of her husband's business on their daughters. At the time, Robert was making huge sums of money from his business and had no intention of giving it up. As the strain on the marriage grew and the girls became more independent, Doris began going into internet chat rooms for communication. The woman wanted to disconnect from her own problems and chat with other people from different parts of the country. What started out as an innocent pastime led to an affair with a married stockbroker from New Jersey. At first, he flew in to meet her in person, and then they met several more times in different places across the country. For the first time, Doris felt truly loved. It was something she had long ceased to feel from Robert, who was only concerned with making a profit. It turns out that 4 weeks before her death, Doris had filed for divorce. According to her brother, Robert took Doris's desire to divorce quite calmly. When detectives asked Robert himself about this, he admitted that recently there had indeed been problems in his relationship with his wife. He respected Doris's decision, but they tried together to save the marriage and even went to see a family therapist. The man was convinced that his wife's death was in no way connected to her affair. While the police were making various assumptions, Robert unexpectedly threw them a new suspect. It was about his own brother, Roger. Roger Angleton, Robert's older brother, was his complete opposite. Robert is a self-sufficient, disciplined, and very restrained person, while Roger is almost wild, impulsive, and at times quite aggressive. The relationship between the brothers was also quite strange. Sometimes they were friends until Roger unexpectedly found a reason to start a fight over any little thing. The older brother clearly had some deep-rooted issues. Robert told the police that initially he had hired Roger to help him in the bookmaking business, but in the end, he had to be fired after only 8 months. The older brother felt he had been treated unfairly and demanded a certain amount of money from Robert in exchange for not going to the police and exposing the illegal activities. The amount was not small, and the brothers made an agreement that Robert would pay Roger monthly until he closed the entire payment. They hadn't seen each other or spoken for many years, and a few months before Doris's death, Roger broke the silence with yet another demand, threatening that if he didn't get $200,000, he would come to Houston and do something Robert would regret for the rest of his life. However, this time, Robert refused, and now he did not rule out the possibility that Roger could have committed the crime just to hurt his younger, more successful brother. To be on the safe side, The police checked Roger's background and found a charge of possession of prohibited substances in San Diego, California. It turned out that Roger had a scheduled court hearing date for this case, but he failed to appear for the hearing. The court date was April 16, 1997, the day Doris died. Detectives traced the suspect's credit card records and learned that he had stayed at several hotels in the Houston area around the time Doris was shot. Then information emerged that Roger had a run-in with security at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport just 5 days after the crime at his brother's home. When his luggage was checked, the metal detector went off. Upon scanning Roger's suitcase, the security guard saw 2 guns inside. The passenger refused to explain, telling the staff that it was his brother's suitcase who was waiting for him at the exit. He quickly left the building, supposedly for his brother, but never returned. When the police opened the suitcase left by Roger at the airport, in addition to the weapons, they found several wigs, hair dye, and .22 caliber cartridges, the same type that Doris was shot with. What seemed like a cautionary tale about the bookmaking business turned out to be a brutal family conspiracy. The deeper the detectives dug into Roger's motives, the more disturbing the case became. 3 weeks after Doris's death, detectives went to San Diego to question the prime suspect, Roger Angleton, but his wife said she had no idea where her husband was. She hadn't spoken to him in several days or even weeks. However, when police reviewed the couple's phone records, they found several recent calls to a number in Nevada. And imagine their surprise when they called that phone and reached the Las Vegas City Jail. It turned out that after escaping from the airport security guards, Roger had somehow made his way to Las Vegas and checked into a motel using a fake ID. Suspecting something was amiss, the hotel manager called the police. Angleton was arrested when they learned he was wanted in San Diego for failing to appear in court. In his personal belongings, $64,000 in cash was found hidden in the lining of his coat. Inside his briefcase, they found some suspicious items, a cassette tape, and several typewritten notes listing alarm codes for the gate and house. Honestly, the Vegas police weren't sure what to do with the recordings, so they simply confiscated them. However, for the Houston detectives, this discovery read like a roadmap to the crime. It indicated the time when the girls' softball game started and the approximate time Doris would return home. But one note stood out among all of this. It mentioned a deal struck between the 2 brothers, where Robert pledged to pay Roger $100,000 over a 10-year period, a $1 million contract. The investigators wanted to ask the arrested Roger Angleton numerous questions, attempting to persuade him to reveal everything that transpired, why he took Doris's life, whether he acted alone, the reason someone wanted to eliminate Robert's wife, and why the younger brother promised to pay him such a substantial sum of money. Roger vowed to disclose everything once they returned to Houston. However, before he uttered a single word, the mini cassette from his briefcase spoke for him. The only issue was that the recording quality left much to be desired. Roger and another individual were apparently conspiring to plot against a woman. The unidentified person instructed the perpetrator on how to enter and deactivate the alarm system. Then, he was supposed to lock the doors and rearm the house's security before waiting inside for Doris to arrive. It was a well-orchestrated operation. One voice definitely belonged to Roger, and although there was no concrete evidence, the detectives were convinced. The other voice on the tape was that of Robert himself, the grieving husband, actually responsible for his wife's demise. Why Roger even recorded this conversation remained a mystery. In their search for motives, the investigators discovered that Robert Angleton stood to lose far more in a divorce than anyone had anticipated. In February 1997, Doris initiated divorce proceedings, demanding 50% of all assets. Robert offered her half of his estimated wealth, $1,500,000. Doris suspected that this was far from the total amount, and she wanted to proceed legally. She consulted with a lawyer who explained that the only way to do this was to file a tax return that would disclose all of Robert's income. If this happened, Robert could lose everything and, moreover, end up in prison due to his bookmaking activities. The detective speculated that, unwilling to part with his money, The man had made an agreement with his older brother. The plan was for Roger to do the dirty work and then vanish. Robert Angleton knew that the police wouldn't rest until they uncovered the truth and found the person who shot Doris. He needed to secure an ironclad alibi for himself and provide them with a potential perpetrator to absolve himself of all responsibility. However, this plan would only work if Roger managed to disappear, but now the detectives had him locked up in a jail cell with a recording that was as good as a confession. The media exploded when suspicion fell on Robert Angleton. They practically immediately declared him the mastermind behind the crime against his wife when they learned that his older brother Roger had been arrested in Las Vegas. The situation was complicated by the fact that Roger was reluctant to discuss his actions with the detectives. The only person he decided to confide in was reporter and investigator Vanessa Leggett, and only on the condition that she would keep his secrets until the end of the trial. The crux of Roger's story was that after entering into a contract with his brother, according to which Robert was supposed to pay him $1 million, he doubted that his brother would not deceive him. Therefore, he recorded the conversation with him on tape. He wanted to use these recordings as leverage in case Robert refused to pay him the agreed-upon amount for eliminating his wife. He knew his brother well and understood that he would do anything to avoid payments. The Angletons hoped that Roger would manage to change his identity and go into hiding. They were convinced that the police would not be able to piece together all the case materials. On the evening of the softball game, Robert most likely deliberately left the baseball bat in the backyard so that Doris, entering the house through the front door, would walk down the hallway through the entire house. Roger appeared at his brother's house in advance, was able to disable the alarm, get inside, and simply wait for the woman to come home and pass by him. When this happened, Roger shot Doris at close range, and when she fell, he simply emptied both guns into her to deprive her of any chance of survival. Doris knew too much and was becoming a burden. The detectives suspected that Robert had a motive, but catching such a slippery character was not easy, especially after he hired Mike Ramsey, one of the toughest lawyers in Texas at the time. Now this desperate attorney was focused on Robert Angleton's freedom, and he was not accustomed to losing. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like this video. It's really important. At the preliminary hearing, the prosecution suffered its first setback. The judge ruled that the Las Vegas police had improperly searched Roger's briefcase. As a result, the incriminating records and tape could not be used against Roger in court. The prosecution team realized they had a problem, so they approached Roger's lawyer and offered him immunity in exchange for testimony against Robert Angleton. Without the use of the tape recording, they wouldn't be able to present anything against Roger, and he would simply go free. But they needed the older brother's testimony against the younger one. Roger declined the deal and chose a different way out. The detectives working on Doris's death case received a call from the county jail on February 6, 1998, informing them that the defendant had taken his own life. He had inflicted 55 cuts on his wrist with a disposable razor. Roger left a suicide note confessing to the murder of Doris, but denying that Robert had anything to do with it. Most likely, this message, written before his death, was someone's manipulation. Investigative reporter Vanessa Leggett believed that Roger realized that the crime would not go unpunished for them. That's why he decided to take all the blame on himself, showing familial feelings towards his brother. He was giving him a chance to remain free. Robert's lawyers already wanted to take advantage of the moment, insisting that the note was proof of their client's innocence, but they were not allowed to do so. The autopsy revealed that Roger suffered from severe heart disease. Perhaps he knew his days were numbered and made a farewell gift to his younger brother. Nevertheless, prosecutors intended to proceed with the case against Robert, and their last hope was Roger's poorly recorded cassette. An audio expert compared the voice on the Angleton tape to a set of phrases spoken by Robert into a police microphone and concluded that there was an 80% probability that the voice belonged to someone else, not Robert. The detectives and prosecutors were at their wits' end and realized the futility of the accusation. The case seemed doomed, but they were not going to give up without a fight. In July 1998, 15 months after his wife's murder, Robert Angleton entered a crowded courtroom in Houston. Prosecutors insisted that the only person in the world with a motive to shoot Doris was her husband. His older brother Roger had done him a favor, allowing Robert to get out of the divorce proceedings initiated by his wife without going to court or the tax authorities. Even though their own experts were 80% certain that the voice on the tape was not Robert's, the prosecution risked everything and presented the audio recording as evidence. The interlocutors discussed how to stage the attack on Doris as a robbery. Roger even asked if he should steal the wedding ring from the woman's hand, to which his opponent replied that no finger cutting was necessary. Only a person who had some kind of relationship with the victim during her lifetime could say that. In another part of the recording, the men discussed what to do with the family dog, and it was decided to lock it in one of the bathrooms. The defense insisted that this conversation took place between Roger and a hitman he hired of his own volition. But this was a wild claim. It was unlikely that any hitman would worry about the dog. He would just shoot it. But for Robert, who loved his dog, it would matter if his pet was harmed. On the last day of the trial, the defense team finally fought back by calling the 14-year-old Angleton twins as witnesses. Of course, both girls confirmed that the voice on the tape did not belong to their father. They could be understood. Having lost their mother in an instant, they could not lose their second parent as well. After 8 days of testimony, the jury began deliberating, trying to reach an agreement. It seemed that initially they supported the prosecution's version, and the prosecutors eagerly awaited their verdict. But when the jury announced its decision, everyone was shocked. The verdict stated that Robert Angleton was found not guilty. No one could believe it because the crime seemed quite obvious, and there was practically no doubt about who was responsible for Doris's death. The entire community was in shock. Nevertheless, Robert was acquitted. 2 months after the trial, Angleton agreed to pay the IRS $1,700,000, but the FBI hasn't finished with him yet. They kept an eye on him, hoping he would slip up and return to bookmaking. The FBI launched a full-scale investigation into Bob's betting activities. It turned out that he could not stay within the law for long. Justice in the Doris Angleton case finally got a second chance. Federal prosecutors believed that the key to Robert's acquittal was the poor quality and poor handling of Roger's tape recording. In the conversation recording presented in court, not a word could be understood. This time, FBI experts took on the investigation of the cassette. They digitized the recording and were able to significantly improve its quality. Investigative reporter Vanessa Leggett, who had spoken to every witness in the case and had tape recordings of those conversations, was called to court. The agents wanted to obtain what she knew, hoping to find some additional leads, but Leggett refused to cooperate. Vanessa stated that she had press privileges and did not need to disclose her sources or hand over the recordings. She justified her position by saying that she could not let down the people who had trusted her. Vanessa Leggett was charged with contempt of court and sent to prison. Ironically, while Leggett was in federal prison, Robert Angleton was freely roaming the streets of Houston. After 6 months, Leggett was released because federal prosecutors decided to continue the investigation without her help. Instead, they arrested Robert Angleton on federal charges of conspiracy to commit murder for hire and illegal possession of a firearm. The reason they were able to use this was that Robert had brought Roger across state lines from San Diego to commit the crime for him. The trial was set to begin in Houston. Robert waived bail and turned the federal case into an international drama. 6 years after Doris Angleton was shot, her husband Robert was due to appear in federal court. The hearing was scheduled for June 12th, but Robert did not show up. He had somehow managed to escape. However, Robert's life on the run was short-lived. He was detained at Amsterdam International Airport with a fake passport. A customs officer who noticed a discrepancy in the identification decided to conduct a full search of the passenger's belongings. The search revealed $135,000 in cash and several other documents with different names. However, there was another snag in returning Robert to Houston. The Dutch government rejected the U.S. extradition request. The only way was to drop the pursuit of higher charges against him, and only charge him with tax evasion, money laundering, and document forgery. Robert's flight from justice ended in 2004 when the Dutch government finally agreed to a conditional extradition. 3 months later, Robert pleaded guilty to the charges. His total sentence was 12 years and 3 months, and he was set to be released in 2014. The agreement with the Netherlands allowed the feds to re-indict Robert for conspiracy to murder Doris as soon as he was released. And everyone was waiting for that to happen. Angleton was released from prison in 2012. He did not wait to be charged again and went on the run. Unfortunately, Robert never faced justice for orchestrating the crime against his wife. Is an individual shaped by their surroundings, or are their deeds a consequence of their personal decisions? Does the adage, "Everything we possess in life, we either earned or permitted," hold true? What are your thoughts? On a gloomy evening in March 2010, paramedics were summoned to a residence in Escambia County, Florida. A 19-year-old lady had been subjected to a horrific assault. Her wounds were so grave that her skin had darkened and was literally sloughing off her frame. Despite her state, she succeeded in identifying the fiends who had savaged her in this manner. Tina Lasagna Brown was born in July 1970 to Lily and Willie Coleman, who had wed at a tender age. Shortly after Tina's arrival, her brother Willie Coleman Jr. was born just 11 months later. The youthful parents, owing to their immaturity, prioritized socializing over caring for their offspring. The children were frequently left unattended at home or sent to stay with relatives on weekends. Despite the minimal age gap, Tina assumed the role of caretaker for Willie Jr. She looked after her sibling, prepared meals, assisted with schoolwork, accompanied him to and from school, and brought him home after classes. Willie Sr. became involved with a gang and made a living peddling illicit drugs. In mid-1982, he viciously assaulted his wife Lily, after which she refused to continue residing with him under the same roof. She gathered her belongings, initiated divorce proceedings, and departed, leaving her 2 children in the custody of their tyrannical father without attempting to maintain any contact. Willie Sr. persisted in selling white powder directly from their residence, but with Lily gone, he began physically abusing his daughter. Unable to endure the prolonged harassment from an adult male, Tina sought refuge with her paternal grandmother. The girl felt secure and decided to disclose the abuse by Willie Sr., but instead of receiving support, the elderly woman unleashed her fury on the teenager and banished her from the house, insisting that her son would never engage in such behavior and forbidding Tina from appearing in her presence. With nowhere else to go, the girl returned to her father's house, and the assaults resumed. Subsequently, against the wishes of the entire family, Coleman Sr. married his beloved, an aggressive and promiscuous woman named Melinda. The abuse from her father ceased, but Willie Sr. grew dissatisfied with his new wife's infidelity, catching her in the arms of other men on multiple occasions. The household was consumed by turmoil, aggression, alcohol, and illicit substances. The father and stepmother indulged in them and even introduced Tina to the effects of psychotropic drugs. Melinda then coerced her stepdaughter into sleeping with men to earn money for alcohol and entertainment through the exploitation of her young body. Several years later, the FBI launched an investigation into Willie Sr.'s involvement in gang activities, leading to his arrest and a year-long prison sentence. During this period, Tina temporarily moved in with her mother, but due to the strict rules in Lily's household, constant arguments erupted between them, resulting in the girl being kicked out onto the streets once again. Friends, over 90% of viewers watch videos without subscribing to the channel. Check if you're subscribed. If not, please be so kind as to subscribe to the channel to support me. Tina moved in with her aunt. The teenager's upbringing was so inconsistent and unhealthy that she had difficulties in school, transferring between several educational institutions over a span of 4 years. Although Tina ultimately earned her diploma, it could not erase the years of mistreatment and degradation she had endured. Lacking a stable residence and grappling with drug addiction due to the influence of her wicked stepmother Melinda, The girl found herself in a dubious location inhabited by other young people in similar circumstances. There, Tina encountered Greg Miller, another individual battling synthetic substance addiction. Despite the volatile nature of their relationship, they remained together for an extended period. The woman gave birth to 2 children, but due to the mother's way of life, the children were afflicted with various ailments. During her 3rd pregnancy, Tina separated from Greg and found herself in a rehabilitation facility, where she gave birth to her 3rd child, Brittany Miller. Rather than placing her children in foster care, Tina agreed to undergo addiction treatment. She entrusted her first 2 infants to her mother Lily for adoption and, through rehabilitation, managed to retain custody of Brittany. The woman put forth her best efforts to be a nurturing mother and abstained from substance use for a total of 4 years. Throughout her own childhood, Tina had been deprived of love and affection from her parents, robbed of a carefree youth, so she resolved to do everything in her power to safeguard her own children. Tina met a new man and married him, but following the wedding, she was confronted with devastating news. Her husband had been arrested and imprisoned for selling and distributing illicit drugs. Tina secured employment as a bartender and once again encountered a young man who captured her attention. It seemed that the woman subconsciously gravitated towards men associated with the lifestyle she had renounced, as if drawn to temptation. Although Tina did her utmost to persevere, her life with this man was far from prosperous, marked by quarrels that escalated into violence and constant humiliation. The woman managed to break free from this oppression when her partner was also incarcerated. However, Tina struggled to manage her life and found herself without means of support. In desperation, she resorted to writing fraudulent checks, for which she was apprehended and faced criminal charges. Consequently, the woman turned to exotic dancing as a means to obtain some income. It was during this period that she relapsed, succumbing once more to substance abuse, fraudulent checks, promiscuous encounters, and another arrest. In 2005, when Tina was 35 years old, the court mandated that she undergo treatment. She endeavored to earn an honest living and secured a position as an assistant manager at a catering company. Everything seemed to be going well until another bout of depression and breakdown occurred. In the summer of 2009, Tina resolved to start anew. She relocated to Pensacola, Florida, found employment at a bakery, and settled into a mobile home park with her daughter, Brittany Miller. However, the income earned was insufficient to cover their expenses, so Tina gradually began offering intimate services in exchange for money. Her best friend Heather's husband was listed among her regular clients. Initially, Tina Brown and Brittany Miller shared a close bond with their neighbors, 27-year-old Heather Lee and 19-year-old Audreanna Zimmerman. Audreanna Zimmerman, born on April 13, 1990, had a childhood and youth shrouded in obscurity. Recently, she had been residing in a mobile home park in Pensacola, Escambia County, Florida. Despite her young age of 19, she was already a mother to 2 children, 2-year-old Trinity and 3-year-old David. As a single mother, she faced financial hardships, as raising and nurturing children required significantly more resources than living alone, and she had no one to rely on for support. Partners proved unreliable, so she turned to her nearest neighbors for assistance. Heather Lee and 39-year-old Tina Brown, along with her teenage daughter, 16-year-old Brittany Miller, became a lifeline for the young mother to some extent. Regrettably, living in such an environment leaves an indelible mark on a person. The reasons that lead individuals to reside in mobile homes often stem from their past experiences, which are rarely positive. The absence of stability and a supportive social circle can result in disagreements between neighbors, escalating beyond verbal altercations and culminating in violence. Commonplace conflicts frequently spiral into something sinister, as individuals leading such a lifestyle may exhibit a total lack of control over their behavior, a prevalent occurrence in this particular setting. At the time, the 4 neighbors had highly volatile relationships. Minor squabbles that escalated into physical altercations could not foster the development of a strong friendship. Grievances accumulated, accusations against one another intensified, and at times, the arguments became so extreme that police intervention was necessary. The majority of the disputes revolved around men. Audreanna was infuriated with Tina, who, following one of the neighbors' disputes, reported to the Florida Department of Children and Families that Audreanna was not providing adequate care for her children. Audreanna was well aware of the potential consequences of the guardianship authorities intervening in her personal life. This would inevitably lead to inspections by the authorities, and if they found anything unsatisfactory, they could easily remove the children from her custody, which was the worst nightmare for any parent. What made the situation even more distressing was that Audreanna had only recently considered Tina her closest friend. For understandable reasons, the young mother was furious, and the neighbors once again found themselves embroiled in conflict. The subject of the dispute now extended beyond the upbringing of children to encompass minor grievances and resentments, and the most frightening aspect was that they snowballed with each passing minute. The third neighbor, Heather Lee, made numerous attempts to act as a mediator between them, but all her efforts proved futile. Audreanna accused Tina of meddling in affairs that did not concern her, holding her responsible for the arrest of Audreanna's boyfriend. Tina had also allegedly shattered the window of her car. Naturally, Tina did not remain silent in response. She countered with an accusation that the young neighbor had slashed her car tires in the past, prompting her to retaliate by breaking the window. The most recent altercation between the former friends revolved around Brittany's boyfriend. Tina's 16-year-old daughter had somehow discovered that Audreanna had slept with her boyfriend, and as soon as the opportunity for revenge presented itself, the girl attacked Audreanna and attempted to strike her. In response, Audreanna utilized a stun gun. This incident was particularly severe, even for a mobile home park, and once again highlighted the level of well-being in the area. In general, disagreements frequently arose between Audreanna and Brittany. Both girls were essentially still teenagers, despite the fact that one of them was a mother of two. Neither of them possessed the ability to control their emotions and outbursts of rage, which is why the other neighbor, Heather Lee, often had to intervene in their conflicts and break up fights. When Tina learned that her child had been assaulted with a stun gun, she was consumed by anger and resolved not to leave the incident unpunished. There was a clear course of action to address the situation, to involve the police, but Brown, who had suffered abuse from her own father and stepmother during her childhood, was not one to forgive offenses. She decided to take matters into her own hands and exact retribution. Several days passed, but the stun gun incident continued to fester. The thoughts of both mother and daughter remained fixated on seeking revenge against Audreanna. On March 24, 2010, Tina invited Audreanna to her trailer under the pretense of arranging a truce and rekindling their friendship. She decided to set aside all grievances and put an end to the feud. Audreanna was overjoyed, as she had been feeling utterly isolated in her mobile home. She genuinely believed that it was time to cease quarreling and fighting over trivial matters, as they had managed to maintain a friendship and support each other for a period. Thus, the young woman agreed to visit the trailer, unaware of the trap she was about to walk into. Tina, Heather, Brittany, and her 13-year-old friend Mallory were already gathered in the house, awaiting Audreanna's arrival. Brown had decided to employ the same weapon that the neighbor had used against her daughter. She had deliberately concealed a stun gun in advance within one of the cabinets. Brittany informed her friend that they intended to confront Audreanna for all the offenses inflicted upon them, and if Mallory divulged this information to anyone, she would be next, clearly indicating premeditation on Brittany's part. While it is possible that Audreanna had indeed engaged in an intimate relationship with Brittany's boyfriend, provided inadequate care for her children, and perpetrated petty tricks on her neighbors, she was only 19 years old and certainly did not deserve to die. Unaware, around 9 p.m., Audreanna visited the neighboring trailer and within minutes found herself collapsed on the ground after multiple strikes from a stun gun. Unbelievable, intense agony pierced through her entire being, immobilizing her muscles and plunging her into utter terror. The understanding that she was utterly defenseless and powerless compelled the girl to cry out. Audreanna pleaded for assistance, realizing that something truly horrific was about to unfold. Heather Lee came to the aid, but she was assisting not the victim, but the tormentors. The neighbor stuffed a filthy sock into Audreanna's mouth to silence her, while Brittany simultaneously delivered a forceful blow to her face, after which the captive was hauled outside and thrown into the vehicle's trunk. Tina took the driver's seat, and her daughter and neighbor Heather entered the passenger section. 13-year-old Mallory remained in the trailer. Having driven approximately 1.5 miles from the mobile home park, the women reached a spacious glade in a forested region. Audreanna, lying unconscious in the trunk, started to realize that if she didn't escape immediately, the situation could end tragically for her. As soon as the trunk was opened, Audreanna fled from the trio with all her might. She had already begun to rejoice that she had escaped in time when, as misfortune would have it, she stumbled on a tree root and tumbled to the earth. It was already dark, and moreover, Audreanna was in great haste, so she failed to notice the obstruction in her path. Tina and Brittany swiftly caught up to her and commenced the assault right there. The mother again employed a stun gun, while the daughter grabbed a crowbar. Afterward, they exchanged weapons, allowing themselves to torment the overpowered neighbor in various ways. Evidently, these actions brought delight to the two women. When the tool slipped out of Brittany's grasp, she struck Audreanna multiple times with her fist with such force that she fractured her finger. Meanwhile, Tina went to the vehicle's trunk, retrieved a gasoline canister, and returned to the beaten, prone, but still conscious body of the neighbor. Tina could clearly see the severity of Audreanna's injuries and how terrified she was, but it seemed insufficient to her. Although, subsequently, what Audreanna did was incomparable to what they were doing now. Nevertheless, Tina drenched Audreanna's body with gasoline, ignited a lighter, and set her ablaze. And then all three attackers observed as the fire raged, as the girl screamed from unimaginable agony, and how her skin charred. At one point, Brittany even leaped up and down with excitement, yelling, "Burn, bitch!" It's even difficult to fathom that someone could experience joy witnessing such a horrific, excruciating act. Most individuals possess empathy and compassion, but Brittany Miller was apparently not one of them. When Audreanna's body was consumed by the inferno, she remained aware. She was positioned prone as the combustible liquid was poured over her. During the pinnacle of her agonizing torment, she commenced rolling on the earth, seeking to alleviate her anguish, while Heather, Tina, and Brittany nonchalantly entered their vehicle and returned to their residence, anticipating the swift demise of their neighbor. During the journey back to their mobile home, Brittany recalled leaving some belongings at the location, including a taser and a pair of her athletic shoes. She informed her mother, but Tina insisted they would not return. She desired to put some space between them and the actual offense. Tina failed to realize that the discarded items would serve as evidence, primarily indicating their participation. She was simply incapable of coherent reasoning. Despite the women's belief that they had meticulously planned and considered every detail, their actions suggested disarray and a total absence of control over the circumstances. Perhaps they doubted anyone would be concerned about Audreanna Zimmerman's destiny or uncover the reason for her passing. If they, her closest neighbors, regarded her as a disposable object, discarded her like rubbish, and incinerated her, why would others be troubled by her disappearance? It was their underestimation of the girl's identity that led to the subsequent outcome. Remarkably, despite the horrific, life-threatening wounds, Audreanna somehow managed to douse the flames, rise, and trek approximately 1 mile until she reached the closest residence. This dwelling belonged to a man named Terrence Hendrick. That night, he intended to retire early when he thought he heard a faint voice in the yard pleading for assistance. Terrence peered out the window but could not discern anyone in the darkness. Intrigued by the unanticipated visitor, the man stepped onto the porch and gazed into the distance. After a moment, once his eyes adjusted to the absence of light, Hendrick could distinguish the silhouette of a person approaching him. The unfamiliar figure moved as if in slow motion. Terrence immediately realized that someone was in distress and now attempting to seek help. This individual was gravely injured. It was astonishing that the homeowner even heard the voice, as now, standing mere feet from the stranger outside, he could not comprehend a single word. It was revealed to be Audreanna Zimmerman, the girl, who, overcoming the pain, whispered for him to summon emergency services and, unable to remain standing, collapsed on the porch. Hendrik grabbed the phone and settled beside her on the steps. As the girl swayed from side to side, arms extended in front of her, he called 911 and informed the dispatcher that a woman requiring immediate hospitalization had just emerged from the woods near his home. As they sat on the porch awaiting the arrival of the paramedics, Terrence observed that she had a severe head injury. The girl's body appeared entirely black, and it was unclear whether she was wearing any clothing, as it was impossible to distinguish between her skin and any fabric. She emitted a strong odor of burning and gasoline. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like this video. It's really important. The emergency personnel who arrived shortly thereafter were perplexed by the sight of such horrific burns. To their dismay, they realized that their abilities were too limited to alleviate Audreanna's agony in any way. According to rough estimates, approximately 90% of her body was severely burned. Her skin was literally peeling off like a charred piece of paper. She had an extensive head injury, and her jaw was either fractured or dislocated. The medics attempted to treat the skin with oxygen and apply a sterile dressing, but due to the severity of the burns, they lacked sufficient materials to cover the entire body. It was also impossible to stabilize her neck, as the skin began to disintegrate at the slightest touch. It is absolutely inconceivable how Audreanna managed to traverse such a distance at all, with such extensive burns. It is even impossible to fathom the excruciating pain she endured. However, despite all the injuries, Audreanna was conscious and able to communicate to some extent. She had a goal to inform people who had done this to her. The girl sensed that she could lose her mind at any moment, so she managed to provide the ambulance physician with all the details, knowing that her days were numbered and she needed to have time to take care of her little ones and bring the perpetrators to justice. The girl stated that she was struck with a stun gun, dragged out of the house, then hit on the head with a crowbar, after which she was doused with gasoline and set ablaze. Furthermore, she provided the names of all those who had tortured her, gave their addresses, and also requested protection for her children. Even in this condition, Audreanna was thinking about her little ones. This undoubtedly characterized her as a caring mother. And even though she made many mistakes in life, her love for Trinity and David was unwavering. While the girl was being transported to the hospital, she repeatedly asked the doctors if they would be able to save her, and again explained that she went to the trailer where the trap was waiting for her only to reconcile with the neighbors. Unfortunately, the doctors could not promise the impossible, but they assured Audreanna that they would do everything in their power. At the local hospital, Audreanna's condition was stabilized. The doctors induced an artificial coma, and then the victim was airlifted to the University of South Alabama Burn Center in Mobile. The investigators arrived at the scene relatively swiftly. It did not take them long to locate the wooded area where the attack on Audreanna occurred. The police walked from Terrence's house, where the girl sought help, along a dirt path and discovered the remains of a fire. There were more than enough clues around. A pair of white shoes, a strand of hair, a crowbar, a stun gun. There was also a pool of blood, a scrap of paper with red spots, and the remnants of burnt clothing. While the doctors were fighting to save Audreanna's life, and the police were searching for evidence of the crime, Tina, Brittany, and Heather returned to Tina's home, where 13-year-old Mallory was waiting for them. They removed their bloody clothes and shoes and concealed them in a garbage bag. Brittany informed her friend that she had broken her arm while beating Audreanna, so the girls took her mother's car and headed to the hospital. Meanwhile, Tina disposed of the bag containing the bloody clothes by tossing it into a dumpster. When the investigators arrived at the trailer park, they discovered two women in Heather Lee's residence and escorted them to the sheriff's office for questioning, and they apprehended Brittany slightly later when she returned from the hospital. Tina claimed that she had been watching movies all night at her friend Heather's house and that she and Audreanna had indeed reconciled the previous night because there was a misunderstanding between them. But this was all the typical atmosphere of a trailer park, where neighbors periodically quarrel and even fight among themselves. Then, sensing something was amiss, Tina began to imply that Heather Lee frequently verbally abused Audreanna, which she had witnessed. When asked to recount the events of that night, Tina adamantly maintained that she had been watching movies all night until the officers arrived in the morning and requested her to accompany them to the station. Heather was interrogated separately from Tina. The woman denied any involvement in the assault on Audreanna and insisted that she had been cooking fish at home that night. Tina allegedly did visit her, but then returned to her own house, and when she came back she was behaving oddly, pointing to the window and stating that the cops had arrived at the park. The detectives attempted to turn the two neighbors against each other, but they never admitted to anything. After being photographed and providing a DNA sample for analysis, they were both released. On March 26th, the police seized Tina Brown's vehicle for forensic examination. Inside, they managed to discover several drops later identified as Audreanna's blood. Audreanna's DNA was present on the crowbar, on the handle of the stun gun, as well as on the shoes left at the scene and belonging to Brittany Miller. A strand of hair had fallen out of Tina's hairstyle. During this time, Tina contacted her friend Paloma Velli and informed her about what they had done to Audreanna. Tina was aware that Audreanna was still alive and in the hospital, so she asked Pamela if she could complete what they had started and send her to the other world. Pamela declined, and then reached out to the authorities and reported the conversation. Now the police had everything they needed to file charges. On April 9, 2010, Tina, Brittany, and Heather were arrested. This occurred on the very day that Audreanna Zimmerman tragically succumbed to her injuries. The young woman had battled for her life for 16 days following that brutal attack. When the pathologist performed an autopsy to determine the primary cause of death, it was found to be multiple thermal injuries. The only part of the body not affected by the fire was the right ankle and calf. The coroner also discovered numerous blunt force injuries and a laceration on the right side of the skull, which led to internal bleeding. In 2011, Heather Lee actually pleaded guilty to a second-degree felony, agreeing to a deal with the police. She testified against Tina and Brittany to avoid a harsher punishment herself. During interrogations, the woman wept and described how well she treated Audreanna and how she was concerned about her well-being. Heather testified in court, explaining that their intention was only to physically teach Audreanna a lesson, but the situation rapidly escalated out of control. Heather did not participate in the assault at all. She was an unwilling witness who attempted to intervene. It all began with a dispute between Tina and Audreanna and culminated in burning in the forest. In exchange for her confession, Heather Lee was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Tina, on the other hand, continued to maintain her own version that she had been watching movies all night, and therefore she had to face a jury trial. In June 2012, Tina Brown's trial commenced. Several individuals testified as witnesses, including Tina's cellmate, whom she confided in, and recounted the story of Audreanna's massacre. Mallory, Brittany's friend who was present in the trailer during the attack, was also summoned. The girl revealed what she was afraid to report even to her loved ones, as she was intimidated by a similar fate. Of the three attackers, Mallory identified Tina as the most brutal and aggressive. It was this woman that she feared the most. After the crime occurred before her eyes, she genuinely feared for her life. Tina's lawyers, as a mitigating factor, attempted to discuss Tina's challenging childhood filled with deprivation. They emphasized that the consequences of childhood traumas had an impact on her entire life. The defense managed to obtain witness testimony from the defendant's sons, her brother, and other relatives. However, a medical examination revealed that at the time of the crime, Tina acted purposefully and logically. No mental illnesses capable of clouding the mind and turning off the intellect were found in her. The woman had a clear understanding of what she was doing and did not experience any emotional turmoil simultaneously. After deliberation, the jury found Tina Brown guilty of a first-degree felony and recommended a death sentence. Their opinion was unanimous, particularly due to the disgusting, brutal, and cruel nature of the crime. It was stated that the aggravating circumstances outweighed the mitigating ones. Tina Brown apologized to Audreanna's family and admitted that she indeed participated in taking Audreanna's life, which she did not deserve. Despite the fact that 3 individuals participated in the massacre of Audreanna, they were all in different positions. Brittany Miller was under 18 at the time of the crime. By law, she could not be sentenced to death, so she received a life sentence. The sentence can be reviewed after serving 15 years in prison. This does not mean that she will ever be released, but at least she has an opportunity to reconsider her life and start anew, unlike her mother, Tina Brown, who raised her daughter to be like herself. This is the end of the story. Like the video and leave your thoughts in the comments. This was Jeremy. See you soon.